Imagine walking through a quiet, suburban Chicago neighborhood, where children play in the yards, neighbors exchange friendly hellos, and life seems perfectly ordinary. You pass by a well-kept house, the kind that blends seamlessly into the community. But behind its neatly painted walls and locked doors, unimaginable horrors are hidden. Inside lives Wayne Gacy, a man known to his neighbors as a cheerful, charming contractor, even someone who donned a clown costume for parties, bringing laughter to children. Yet behind that smile, behind the mask of charm, lurked a darkness so terrifying that it would shock the entire nation. For years, he lured young men into his home, men who would never be seen again. And the scariest part? For years, the world around him never suspected a thing. Tonight, we peel back the layers of deception, explore the sinister mind of the man they called the Killer Clown, and step into the chilling world where trust and horror collided in the most unimaginable ways. By the end of this, you might be drifting off to sleep, but if this story kept you hooked even for a moment, go ahead and like the video. You can subscribe for more true crime stories, and maybe leave a comment sharing what shocked you most about Ted Bundy. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Chapter 1: A Mask of Smiles. The early life of Wayne Gacy. On the surface, Wayne Gacy's childhood in the working-class neighborhoods of Chicago looked almost ordinary. Born on March 17, 1942, in the Windy City to John Stanley Gacy and Marion Elaine Robinson, he was the second of 3 children in a devoutly Catholic family. His father, a World War I veteran and hard-working mechanic, carried with him the scars of the Great Depression and the rigid, stoic ideals of early 20th century American masculinity. His mother, in contrast, was nurturing and protective, trying to create a calm refuge within a home often dominated by her husband's temper. From an early age, Gacy's life was a study in contradictions. He was a pudgy, soft-spoken boy who desperately craved his father's approval but rarely received it. John Stanley Gacy was known to drink heavily and could be explosively violent. He often berated young John as weak or sissy for avoiding sports and preferring indoor activities. Gacy would later recall that his earliest memories included being hit with a leather belt and called names that cut deeper than the physical bruises. In his mother's gentle embrace he found comfort, but in his father's shadow he learned to hide his vulnerabilities. This dynamic planted the seeds of a lifelong split between outward appearances and hidden truths. While his father was quick to criticize, his mother and sisters doted on him. They saw a boy who liked to garden, who could be charming and polite, and who enjoyed dressing neatly for church. He had a flair for attention even then, an almost theatrical way of smiling and performing for adults, perhaps to escape the sting of his father's contempt. Teachers described him as friendly but not remarkable academically, and he sometimes fainted from what doctors believed were heart-related episodes, though later testing revealed no serious heart condition. Whether these episodes were psychosomatic or genuine remains a mystery, but they earned him time at home and out of the rough playground politics of boyhood. By the time Gacy reached his early teens, his sense of alienation deepened. He struggled with his weight, was chosen last in sports, and began experiencing confusing sexual feelings he could not safely share with anyone. In 1957, a serious head injury from a playground swing, striking him on the temple, reportedly left him unconscious for a time. He would later claim that he suffered blackouts and occasional memory lapses after this incident. Some criminologists speculate that this may have contributed to later personality changes, though the evidence is circumstantial. What is clear is that Gacy's inner world was increasingly defined by secrecy and compartmentalization. Even as he tried to maintain an image of the dutiful son, Gacy's father remained a looming presence. When John got a part-time job delivering newspapers or working at local stores, his father dismissed his efforts. Yet when he managed to charm adults outside the home, earning praise for his manners and reliability, his father's scorn only grew sharper. This paradox forced young John into a coping strategy. He became adept at telling people what they wanted to hear. He learned to smile through criticism, to offer polite words even while seething or hurting inside. That skill would later make him seem trustworthy to victims, parents, and even police officers. Despite the tension, there were moments of warmth. Family photographs show a boy who could light up a room with his grin. Holidays were celebrated, and church attendance was regular. Gacy served as an altar boy and participated in youth activities. He liked to cook and help around the house. His mother, Marion, repeatedly reassured him that he was special and good, trying to offset the relentless negativity from his father. These conflicting messages, special yet unworthy, loved yet humiliated, created a psychological push and pull that would define Gacy's relationships for decades at BY High School. He was still not a standout student. His grades hovered at average levels, and he failed to complete some courses on time. He tried joining the Boy Scouts and school clubs but never fully fit in. Yet he had an almost uncanny ability to win over adults, especially women and authority figures who saw him as polite and eager to help. This chameleon-like quality would later allow him to blend seamlessly into respectable society, while leading a far darker life. It was also during adolescence that Gacy began to experiment with the kind of role-playing and performance that would later culminate in his infamous clown persona. He took part in school plays and community events, drawn to the thrill of entertaining. In these moments he could become someone else entirely, someone not scorned by his father, someone who could command applause instead of insults. The seeds of Pogo the Clown, his future alter ego, were faint but present even then. Meanwhile, his health problems persisted. In addition to the fainting spells, he was diagnosed with a congenital heart condition, though some doctors doubted the seriousness of it. Regardless, it gave him an excuse to avoid rough sports and further deepened his outsider status among boys his age. He spent more time with his mother and sisters, reinforcing a pattern of identifying with the feminine side of his household while feeling alienated from the masculine authority represented by his father. When Gacy reached the age of 18, his relationship with his father hit a breaking point. In one oft-recounted incident, his father accused him of faking his health problems and called him a mama's boy in front of relatives. Humiliated and angry, John left home temporarily, trying to find work and independence. Yet he kept returning, drawn back by family ties and financial need. This push and pull, rebellion and return, mirrored the cycles that would later characterize his adult life, where he would seek respectability but continually sabotage it with darker impulses. Even at this early stage, one can see the outlines of a man living a double life. Publicly, he was a polite, church-going young man who held part-time jobs and smiled for photographs. Privately, he was nursing resentment, confusion, and secret desires he could not openly express. This split would grow more pronounced with every passing year, eventually shaping him into one of the most notorious figures in American criminal history. In retrospect, criminologists and psychologists studying Gacy's childhood point to a constellation of risk factors. An abusive parent, inconsistent nurturing, possible head trauma, social isolation, health issues, and early experiences of shame tied to identity and sexuality. None of these alone explain the monster he became, but together they formed a volatile foundation. Like a mask painted with bright colors to hide the cracks underneath, Young John Wayne Gacy was already practicing the art of concealment, a skill that would later make him a uniquely terrifying predator. As Gacy stepped out of adolescence and into early adulthood, the pressures that had been mounting within him began to shape his choices in ways that looked, at first, like ordinary attempts at self-improvement. He wanted to escape his father's control and prove that he was capable of building a respectable life. In 1960, at the age of 18, he enrolled in a local business college and started working for a shoe company. For a young man with no college preparation, this was a modest but promising start. He learned salesmanship, how to talk to people, how to project confidence. Even now, though, he remained acutely sensitive to rejection and quick to hide any vulnerability behind charm and politeness. Those who knew him at this time often describe him as eager to please and unusually enthusiastic about work. Gacy had a knack for customer service and management, and he impressed his supervisors. His ability to mask insecurities with humor and friendliness became a professional asset. Coworkers recalled that he was always willing to stay late, help organize social events, and volunteer for extra duties. It was an early version of the pattern that would later define his adult life. On the surface, he appeared as a hard-working, civic-minded citizen. Underneath, he was wrestling with inner turmoil that few could glimpse. Gacy also began exploring civic and social organizations, drawn to groups where he could rise in status. He joined the JCs, a leadership and community service club popular among ambitious young men of the 1960s. The JCs emphasized networking, volunteer work, and self-improvement, but also had a reputation in some chapters for after-hours drinking and sexualized activities. For Gacy, the JCs were a gateway to belonging and recognition. He quickly became active, volunteering for committees, recruiting new members, and winning awards for his energy and organizational skills. But even as he flourished publicly, shadows followed him privately. Gacy's sexual orientation was something he struggled to reconcile with the conservative values of the time and the harsh judgments he had internalized from his father. He dated women and would eventually marry, but in private he engaged in sexual activities with men, often in secret and sometimes under coercive circumstances. Former associates from the JCs later reported rumors of Gacy hosting parties with pornography and inviting young men to participate in sexual encounters. While these accounts remain partly anecdotal, they illustrate the emerging pattern of Gacy's double life: outwardly respectable, inwardly transgressive and exploitative. By 1964, he had moved to Springfield, Illinois, and was working as a manager for a chain of men's clothing stores. His personal charisma and apparent drive earned him rapid promotions. He also became engaged to Marlon Myers, the daughter of a wealthy family with political connections. The marriage promised stability and status, things Gacy craved as proof to himself and his father that he was a success. They married in 1964 and soon had 2 children, a son and a daughter. To outsiders, Gacy appeared to have achieved the American dream: a young family, a good job, and an active role in the community. This image, however, was deceptive. Even as a young husband and father, Gacy was engaging in sexual misconduct with teenage boys. In 1968, he was charged with sexually assaulting a 15-year-old boy in Waterloo, Iowa, where he had moved to manage 3 Kentucky Fried Chicken franchises owned by his father-in-law. The allegations shocked the JCs and the local community. Gacy, who had been seen as a model citizen and volunteer, suddenly faced a public reckoning. He denied the charges but was convicted of sodomy and sentenced to 10 years at the Anamosa State Penitentiary. This prison sentence was a turning point. For the first time, the smiling mask Gacy had worn since childhood cracked under the pressure of public exposure. Yet even in prison, his pattern of adaptation and manipulation resurfaced. He became a model inmate, organizing events, managing the prison canteen, and winning over staff and fellow prisoners. He even completed courses in headstone sales and food service management. After serving only 18 months, he was granted parole in 1970 for good behavior. Upon release, he returned to Chicago to live with his mother. His wife divorced him during his incarceration, taking the children and severing ties. This loss deepened Gacy's sense of grievance, but also freed him from the facade of conventional family life. He vowed to rebuild his reputation, telling friends he had learned from his mistakes. But in reality, the pattern of secrecy and predation that had begun in his youth was now more deeply entrenched than ever. Gacy's early life thus shows how he developed the skills and habits that would later enable his crimes. The ability to present himself as trustworthy, the drive to seek status in community organizations, the compartmentalization of his public and private selves, and the practice of manipulating people's perceptions. Each of these traits can be traced back to the contradictions of his childhood: an abusive father and a protective mother, a yearning for approval and a fear of exposure, a public smile masking private rage. These formative years also highlight a broader theme that criminologists find chilling: the banality of evil's beginnings. There was no single moment in which Gacy became a killer. Instead, there was a slow accumulation of risk factors, habits of concealment, and unaddressed impulses. He was not the archetypal monster lurking in the shadows. He was the neighbor who volunteered for fundraisers, the employee who stayed late, the young man who posed for photographs with civic leaders. This ordinariness made him more dangerous because it allowed him to hide in plain sight. Even now, decades later, looking back on Gacy's early life invites uncomfortable questions. How many warning signs were missed? Could intervention have changed his trajectory? Why did so few people probe the discrepancies between his public image and private behavior? These questions do not have easy answers, but they underscore the chilling fact that a person can be both affable and lethal, both volunteer and predator. By the time Gacy entered his 30s, the boy who once tried to please his father had transformed into a man skilled at manipulating entire communities. The early scars of humiliation had hardened into a mask of confidence and charm. Beneath that mask, darker compulsions were gathering force, soon to erupt in a series of crimes so shocking they would forever alter America's understanding of serial killers. Chapter 2: Ambition and Shadows. Gacy's journey into adulthood. When John Wayne Gacy stepped back into the world after his release from Anamosa State Penitentiary in 1970, he was only 28 years old but had already lived several distinct lives. He had been the shy, overweight boy desperate for his father's approval, the eager young salesman climbing the corporate ladder, the model JC member building connections, the family man with a wife and children, and most recently, the convicted sex offender whose carefully built facade had publicly crumbled. Yet Gacy was nothing if not adaptive. As he returned to Chicago to live with his mother, he began crafting a new version of himself, one that combined all the lessons he had learned about manipulation, appearances, and reinvention. He wasted little time establishing a foothold. In February 1971, Gacy was charged with sexually assaulting another teenage boy. The complaint was dismissed when the witness failed to appear in court, but the incident hinted at how quickly he had resumed risky behavior. That same year, he bought a modest single-story house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in Norwood Park Township, a quiet suburb of Chicago. This house would become the epicenter of his double life. A cheerful home filled with party decorations and clown costumes on the surface, and a sight of unimaginable horror hidden beneath its floorboards. First, Gacy projected an image of stability and upward mobility. He started a part-time contracting business called PDM, short for painting, decorating, and maintenance, while working various jobs. His charm and energy won him small contracts, and before long he was employing teenage boys from the neighborhood to help with tasks. For these young workers, Gacy was a boss who cracked jokes, lent tools, and gave them cash-in-hand jobs. To their parents, he was a respectable local businessman who helped keep their kids occupied and out of trouble. To Gacy, they were potential prey. During this time, Gacy's public persona flourished. He became involved in Democratic Party politics, working on campaigns and even hosting events at his house. Photographs from the era show him smiling alongside Chicago's political figures, shaking hands and wearing crisp suits. His ability to appear normal, indeed admirable, remained undiminished. Neighbors described him as friendly and civic-minded, the type of man who would plow snow from their driveways without being asked. He invited people to barbecues and holiday gatherings. Children from the neighborhood came to see him dressed as Pogo the Clown or Patches the Clown, the two characters he had created for charity events and parties. In the eyes of his community, John Wayne Gacy was not merely respectable. He was generous and even lovable, but beneath this carefully cultivated image, his impulses were darkening. The clown persona, in particular, became more than just a hobby. For Gacy, dressing up as Pogo or Patches allowed him to become someone else entirely, a character who was simultaneously playful and powerful, who could interact with children and adults under a mask of painted innocence. The clown costume provided anonymity and a sense of control, echoing the same duality that had marked his entire life. While Pogo the Clown delighted audiences at hospital visits and charity events, John Wayne Gacy was privately luring teenage boys with offers of work, alcohol, or drugs, then coercing or assaulting them. Psychologists later speculated that the clown persona symbolized Gacy's inner conflict, the desire to entertain and be liked entwined with violent impulses he could not, or would not, resist. Clowns are traditionally ambiguous figures, meant to amuse but also capable of unsettling audiences with their exaggerated features. For Gacy, that ambiguity became a psychological refuge. He could hide behind the grease paint just as he had once hidden behind smiles and politeness as a child. As the 1970s progressed, Gacy's contracting business expanded, giving him more access to young men. Many of his employees were runaways or teenagers in need of quick cash, making them vulnerable and unlikely to report misconduct. Gacy's ability to charm parents and ingratiate himself with local leaders further insulated him from suspicion. Even when boys disappeared after last being seen with him, police initially treated the cases as unrelated runaways, a common assumption during the era of hitchhiking and counterculture freedom. The paradox of Gacy's life during these years is striking. In public, he was a tireless volunteer, a man who dressed as a clown to cheer up sick children, a neighbor who seemed trustworthy enough to leave your kids with. In private, he was refining methods of coercion and concealment, rehearsing the steps that would allow him to kill without detection. He learned to use handcuffs as a magic trick to disarm his victims. He developed techniques for luring them into his home and then disposing of their bodies. Each successful assault or murder reinforced his belief that he could outwit everyone around him. This period also reveals the broader social context that allowed Gacy to operate. The 1970s were a time of transition in American policing, with fragmented databases, limited interagency communication, and lingering assumptions about missing youth. Background checks were rudimentary, and sex offender registries were not yet centralized. As a result, Gacy's prior conviction in Iowa did not automatically alert Chicago authorities or employers. He exploited these gaps ruthlessly, counting on society's trust in appearances and credentials. By the mid-1970s, Gacy had perfected his public mask. He could attend political fundraisers one night and commit unspeakable crimes the next. He could charm police officers who knocked on his door looking for missing teenagers, offering them coffee while the crawl space beneath his house slowly filled with bodies. To neighbors, he was the man who hung elaborate Christmas decorations and lent out tools. To his victims, he was a predator hiding in plain sight. The tension between these two worlds, public respectability and private horror, was reaching a breaking point. As Gacy accumulated more victims, the logistics of hiding his crimes became increasingly complex. The crawl space beneath 8213, West Summerdale Avenue, originally just a narrow cavity under the floor, was expanded and dug deeper to accommodate more bodies. This grotesque secret existed only a few feet below the surface of suburban normality, a chilling metaphor for the duality of Gacy's life. The more John Wayne Gacy succeeded in crafting his public image, the more he seemed to believe in his own invulnerability. By the middle of the 1970s, he had created an almost impenetrable facade. The self-employed contractor, the friendly neighbor, the political volunteer, and the clown who made children laugh. Each of these roles provided cover for his darker compulsions. The contrast between what the world saw and what was happening behind closed doors at 8213, West Summerdale Avenue grew sharper, but Gacy remained confident that no one could pierce his mask. His home became both stage and sanctuary. It was the site of dinner parties, political gatherings, and family visits. But after the guests left and the lights dimmed, it transformed into a private hunting ground. Many of the young men who came to work for PDM contractors were invited into the house under the pretext of discussing jobs or picking up paychecks. Gacy offered them drinks, showed them pornography, or performed his infamous handcuff trick, claiming he could demonstrate how police restrained suspects. Once the cuffs were on, the playful host could instantly become a captor, and the atmosphere shifted from casual to terrifying. Forensic psychologists later pointed out that these rituals, the handcuff trick, the use of alcohol, the invitation to his home, served as a form of rehearsal and control. They allowed Gacy to transform ordinary social interactions into predatory scenarios without raising suspicion at first. This predatory grooming mirrored the way he had groomed his public persona, incrementally, carefully, until the victim or the community was fully disarmed. Even as disappearances mounted, Gacy leveraged his community ties to deflect suspicion. He continued to appear at fundraisers and parades, sometimes even in full clown costume. He posed for photographs with local officials, including future First Lady Rosalynn Carter at a 1978 event, where he was given a security badge as a volunteer. That photograph, Gacy in a suit and tie, beaming next to a national figure, would later become one of the most chilling images in American criminal history, a testament to how completely he had embedded himself into respectable society while committing unspeakable acts. Behind the scenes, though, the practical challenges of concealment were increasing. The crawl space beneath his house, which he had begun using as a burial site, was filling up. Gacy hired employees to dig trenches under the guise of installing drainage pipes, but in reality these trenches became graves for his victims. When the crawl space reached capacity, he began disposing of bodies in the nearby Des Plaines River, a desperate adaptation that would ultimately draw law enforcement closer. This escalation reveals a key feature of Gacy's criminal trajectory. His crimes were not static but evolved with circumstances. Each murder reinforced his sense of control, but also created logistical pressures that made mistakes more likely. As his compulsion grew, the careful predator became a risk-taker, a pattern criminologists recognize in serial offenders. The same overconfidence that had helped him build his public mask also blinded him to the growing danger of exposure. Still, for much of the decade, Gacy enjoyed an extraordinary degree of freedom. Police departments in the 1970s lacked the integrated databases and forensic technology that later became standard. Missing persons reports were often handled locally and inconsistently, with little communication between jurisdictions. Many of Gacy's victims were young men from troubled backgrounds, some estranged from their families, which made their disappearances less likely to spark immediate or coordinated investigations. Gacy exploited these systemic weaknesses, just as he exploited the vulnerabilities of his victims. His ability to compartmentalize remained astonishing. Friends and neighbors saw a man who hosted elaborate holiday displays, lent tools to anyone who asked, and never failed to show up for community events. Business associates saw a hard-working contractor who could handle multiple projects at once. Political acquaintances saw a loyal volunteer eager to help. And the children at hospitals and parties saw a cheerful clown who bent balloons into animals and told jokes. Only in the privacy of his home, late at night, did the mask drop, revealing the predator beneath. This double life took a psychological toll even on Gacy himself. According to later interviews and reports, he began drinking more heavily and experiencing mood swings. Yet he remained disciplined about appearances. He continued to pay his bills, expand his business, and attend social functions. In this sense, he embodied the terrifying possibility that monstrous behavior can coexist with everyday normality, not as a momentary lapse but as a sustained lifestyle. Gacy's use of the clown persona during this period is particularly chilling when viewed in retrospect. At the time, few people saw clowns as anything other than light-hearted entertainers. The idea of the evil clown was not yet a staple of popular culture. Gacy's Pogo and Patch's characters were brightly colored, with exaggerated smiles, oversized shoes, and balloon animals. To children, he was harmless fun. To adults, a sign of his community spirit. But for Gacy, the costume was more than entertainment. It was transformation. It allowed him to inhabit an identity that was free of the shame and restraint he felt in his normal life. As a clown, he could be unpredictable, dominant, even menacing, under the guise of humor. By the late 1970s. However, the cracks in Gacy's facade were starting to show. Rumors circulated about his relationships with young men. Employees sometimes complained of being propositioned or feeling uncomfortable at his house. Parents began to warn their sons to be careful. Police took note of his name in missing persons cases, though without concrete evidence they could not act. Each of these developments foreshadowed the eventual unraveling of his carefully constructed world. Still, at this moment in the narrative, Gacy remained a master manipulator, straddling two worlds. Above ground, he was a contractor, a clown, a volunteer. Below ground, literally beneath the floors of his house, he was a serial killer. The crawl space had become a physical embodiment of his secret life, a dark underworld hidden just beneath the surface of suburban normality. As long as that underworld stayed buried, Gacy believed he could continue living his double life indefinitely. Chapter 3: A Double Life Emerges. Respectable citizen, hidden predator. By the time the mid-1970s arrived, John Wayne Gacy had fully woven himself into the fabric of suburban Chicago life. To neighbors, he was a jovial fixture at community gatherings. To local politicians, he was an eager volunteer whose house could host fundraisers at a moment's notice. To young men looking for odd jobs, he was a friendly boss who paid in cash and promised opportunity. Yet beneath that affable exterior, A second, hidden existence was hardening into something systematic and deadly. The double life that criminologists would later cite as his defining trait was no longer an accident born of shame. It had become his strategy for survival. The Summerdale Avenue house symbolized this duality perfectly. Above ground, its small rooms were decorated with photos of Gacy shaking hands with civic leaders, shelves of knickknacks, and family mementos. The living room sometimes held political banners or stacks of paperwork for local campaigns. Guests described it as messy but normal, a bachelor's home filled with conversation and the smell of cooking. Yet just beneath the floorboards lay a hidden labyrinth, a crawl space gradually transformed into a clandestine burial ground. Gacy had begun expanding it with the help of his employees, telling them he was improving drainage or storage. They dug trenches without knowing their true purpose. In effect, the young men he employed were building the very place where some of them would end up. This was also the period when Gacy began refining his methods of luring and controlling victims. The handcuff trick, which he had practiced before, became a central feature of his attacks. He would present it as a playful demonstration. "You want to see a magic trick? See how I can get out of these cuffs." Once the teenager or young man tried them on, thinking it was a joke, Gacy would secure the cuffs, snap them shut, and utter the chilling words he later repeated to investigators. "The trick is you have to have the key." With the victim immobilized, Gacy could escalate to sexual assault or murder. The casual pretense of a trick allowed him to lower defenses, just as his clown persona allowed him to disarm communities. Despite the mounting disappearances of young men in the Chicago area, Gacy's name rarely came up as more than a passing reference. The era's fragmented law enforcement systems meant that missing persons reports were handled piecemeal. Police often assumed runaways, especially teenage boys, had left voluntarily. Families were left frustrated and anxious, but without evidence of foul play, cases languished. This systemic blind spot became Gacy's greatest ally. He understood that society paid less attention to vulnerable youth, and he exploited that indifference with calculated precision. At the same time, his public persona was thriving. Photographs from this era show him in sharply pressed suits at Democratic Party events, his arm around local officials, his smile broad and confident. He gained a reputation as a man who knew people, a fixer who could get things done. He entertained guests with stories, jokes, and a seemingly bottomless energy for civic life. Even when rumors circulated about his sexual advances toward employees or neighborhood boys, they were brushed off as gossip. After all, how could such a generous, hard-working man be dangerous? This disconnect between perception and reality is one of the most striking features of Gacy's case. In later interviews, survivors and acquaintances expressed disbelief that the man they knew could be capable of murder. Part of this disbelief stemmed from Gacy's mastery of small kindnesses. He lent money to neighbors, helped fix fences, and drove people to appointments. He gave free rides to young men he barely knew. These gestures built a reservoir of goodwill that insulated him from suspicion. In psychological terms, he was engaging in impression management, curating a persona so appealing that even those who felt uneasy about him hesitated to voice concerns. The clown persona deepened during these years. Gacy performed as Pogo at children's hospitals, fundraising events, and parades. He made balloon animals, painted faces, and cracked jokes. Adults saw a middle-aged man giving back to the community. Children saw a colorful figure of fun. Yet there was something unsettling about Pogo's makeup even then. Unlike traditional rounded clown features, Gacy painted sharp points at the corners of his mouth and eyes, a style that professional clowns often avoid because it appears sinister rather than friendly. Whether intentional or not, his version of Pogo carried a hint of menace beneath the cheer. Meanwhile, the crawl space beneath his house filled slowly but relentlessly. Initially, Gacy buried victims in shallow graves, sometimes sprinkling lime to control odor. As space ran out, he stacked bodies in trenches or covered them with plastic. The physical act of digging and burying became a grim ritual, reinforcing his sense of control. It also reflected the compartmentalization of his psyche, a literal underworld hidden beneath the floorboards of his respectable life. Just as he buried bodies, he buried the evidence of his crimes, and perhaps parts of his own conscience. Criminologists later argued that this period marked Gacy's transformation from opportunistic offender to organized serial killer. His crimes became less impulsive and more patterned. He developed routines for luring, restraining, killing, and disposing of victims. He learned which questions to ask to gauge vulnerability, which excuses to offer if someone grew suspicious, which lies to tell if police knocked on his door. Each successful deception reinforced his belief that he was untouchable. Yet traces of recklessness began to appear. He sometimes bragged to acquaintances about his tricks with handcuffs or his sexual exploits with young men. He told conflicting stories about his past, claiming at times to have been framed for his Iowa conviction. He grew bolder in approaching teenagers, offering them jobs or rides even in public settings. Like many serial offenders, his sense of invincibility became both his shield and his Achilles heel. By the late 1970s, Gacy was living almost entirely within this double life. The respectable citizen and the hidden predator were no longer separate compartments but overlapping realities. He could attend a political banquet one evening and commit murder hours later without missing a beat. He had become a master of masks, not just the painted face of Pogo the clown, but the invisible mask of normalcy that allowed him to walk among unsuspecting neighbors. It was this mask, more than any specific trick or costume, that made him so dangerous and so difficult to catch. As the 1970s edged toward their close, John Wayne Gacy's two worlds, the bright, civic-minded neighbor and the hidden predator, were no longer just running parallel. They were beginning to bleed into each other. His ability to maintain the mask remained impressive, but small cracks started appearing. To an outside observer in 1977 or 1978, Gacy's life might still have looked enviable. He owned his own home, ran a successful contracting business, and was a familiar face at local political functions. Yet underneath, his crimes were escalating in frequency, and the logistical challenges of maintaining secrecy were beginning to show. The crawl space beneath his Summerdale Avenue home had become a grim archive of his offenses. Initially, Gacy dug shallow graves himself, working at night by flashlight, but as his business grew and his schedule filled, he sometimes asked employees to dig trenches for drainage or pipes. These trenches became graves. He wrapped victims in plastic sheeting, sometimes layering them with lime to mask odor. The earth under the house shifted with each new burial, creating an unstable underworld literally propping up the life he showed to the world above. Gacy's routine by this time was chillingly efficient. He would approach teenage boys or young men with offers of quick jobs, rides, or a place to crash. Alcohol or marijuana might be part of the lure. Once in his home, he played the genial host, cracking jokes, putting on a record, perhaps showing off his clown costumes or performing a magic trick. Then the handcuffs. Then the shift from friendliness to dominance. For some victims, he used a tourniquet-like device to strangle them while sexually assaulting them, a method he would later describe matter-of-factly to investigators. Afterward, he buried them in the crawl space or, when space ran out, disposed of them in the Des Plaines River. This pattern was not simply about killing, it was about control. Psychologists analyzing Gacy's behavior note that each step of his ritual, from the lure to the handcuffs to the burial, reinforced his power over the victim. It mirrored, in an inverted way, the powerlessness he had felt as a child under his father's hand. In exerting absolute control over others, he may have been trying to erase his own sense of weakness. But the satisfaction was temporary, and with each killing his compulsion deepened, requiring repetition. At the same time, Gacy's public persona was reaching its peak. He secured more contracts through PDM, expanded his social circle, and even boasted of connections to city officials. He hosted large summer parties at his house, drawing dozens of guests, some of whom were political figures. He took photographs with visiting dignitaries, projecting the image of a man deeply embedded in the civic fabric of Chicago's northwest suburbs. This double life was so successful that even when police began to take a closer look at him, he could still bluff his way through conversations, offering coffee and jokes while bodies lay buried just feet away. Neighbors, however, began noticing oddities. There were complaints of foul odors seeping from the crawl space, which Gacy explained away as plumbing problems or dead rodents. He sometimes dug in the yard late at night or had young men working in the basement at strange hours. The comings and goings of teenagers raised eyebrows, but because Gacy appeared respectable and friendly, few suspected the scale of what was happening. In a working-class suburb where people kept to themselves, odd behavior did not automatically trigger alarm bells. Especially from someone known for his civic involvement, Gacy's clown persona also became more prominent during these years. As Pogo and Patches, he performed at children's hospitals, charitable events, and even private parties. In retrospect, the image of a serial killer in a clown suit seems almost too grotesque to be true, but at the time it simply read as quirky community spirit. Clowns in the 1970s were symbols of harmless fun. Think Bozo the Clown or Ronald McDonald, not of horror. Gacy's decision to perform as a clown fit his pattern of seeking attention and admiration, but it also offered him a psychological outlet, a mask he could hide behind. Some criminologists have suggested that the clown persona symbolized Gacy's inner split. The painted smile allowed him to project joy while hiding darker impulses. The costume provided anonymity and a sense of invulnerability. As a clown, he could bend social norms, behave unpredictably, and still be in character. Whether or not Gacy consciously linked his clowning to his crimes, the two became inseparable in the public imagination once his deeds were revealed. By 1978, the number of young men vanishing after contact with Gacy had grown, and the sheer scale of his crimes was making secrecy harder to maintain. The crawl space was crowded. The smell persisted despite lime and plastic. He began discarding bodies in the Des Plaines River, a riskier method that left evidence for investigators. Yet he still felt untouchable. He told friends he was well-connected politically and could handle any problem. He spoke confidently to police officers who questioned him, even inviting them into his home. He maintained his business and his social calendar as if nothing were wrong. This overconfidence was a classic turning point in the trajectory of serial offenders. The very traits that allowed Gacy to evade detection, his charm, his manipulation, his community ties, also fed his belief that he was immune to consequence. Each successful deception reinforced that belief, making him bolder. He underestimated the persistence of some families searching for their missing sons and the growing sophistication of local investigators. The net was tightening, even if he could not yet feel it. Looking back, this period of Gacy's life reads like a grim balancing act. Above ground, he cultivated normalcy and goodwill, hosting parties and performing as a clown. Below ground, in the crawl space, he stacked evidence of his crimes. He had turned his own home into a stage for a macabre theater where he played every role: host, clown, predator, gravedigger. The walls of that theater were closing in, but until the end of 1978, he believed he was still the director of the play. Chapter 4: The First Suspicions. Missing Boys and Unanswered Questions. By the mid-1970s, the string of disappearances around Chicago's northwest suburbs was starting to form a troubling pattern. Young men and teenage boys, many from working-class families or transient backgrounds, were vanishing without explanation. Some had last been seen near bus stops. Others had told friends or relatives they were heading to a job interview or going to work for a contractor named John. A few had even given the name Gacy before disappearing. Yet despite these clues, the cases remained scattered across multiple jurisdictions, handled by different police departments with little coordination. Families of the missing boys began to feel as though their pleas were echoing into a void. Many of the victims were runaways or estranged from their parents, making it easy for authorities to assume they had left voluntarily. In an era before national databases or widespread media alerts, a missing person case could languish for months without significant investigation unless foul play was immediately evident. Gacy exploited this gap in the system, knowing that his victims were less likely to trigger a rapid or coordinated search. Still, a few detectives began to notice the pattern. In particular, some officers in Cook County and neighboring Des Plaines saw that certain names, PDM contractors, a house on Summerdale Avenue, a friendly man who offered jobs, kept recurring in witness statements. But without a body, without a crime scene, and without modern forensic tools like DNA testing, suspicion alone was insufficient. Gacy remained a helpful, even cooperative citizen whenever questioned. He would invite detectives into his home, offer them coffee, and smile as they looked around. Meanwhile, his life above ground remained outwardly wholesome. He continued to perform as Pogo or Patches the Clown at charity events and parades, visiting children in hospitals and handing out balloon animals. He expanded his business and maintained his status as a reliable local contractor. In photographs from this period, he appears cheerful and stocky, with a broad smile and neat hair, hardly the image of a monster. Friends and neighbors described him as generous and hardworking. For the families of missing boys, this contrast was maddening. How could a man so publicly visible also be a predator? One particularly poignant case that drew renewed attention was the disappearance of a teenage boy who had gone to meet Gacy about a contracting job. Witnesses placed the boy with Gacy shortly before he vanished. The boy's mother pressed authorities to investigate more thoroughly, insisting that Gacy be questioned. Detectives did speak with him, but he produced plausible explanations and even paperwork showing that the boy had never officially been on his payroll. He joked about the rumors and invited officers to search his house if they wanted, knowing full well that the crawl space below was sealed off and that, at the time, warrants for such searches were difficult to obtain. This ability to project normalcy while hiding evidence was central to Gacy's evasion of justice. He used charm, legal savvy, and sheer audacity to keep suspicion at bay. He also played on societal biases. In the 1970s, crimes against young men, especially those perceived as gay or transient, received less urgency from many police departments. Gacy exploited that indifference, targeting those who were least likely to trigger a rapid and thorough search. But cracks were widening in his facade. Some of Gacy's employees began sharing stories of uncomfortable encounters. A few had been propositioned, threatened, or subjected to unwanted advances. One young man even reported an assault to police, but the case went nowhere due to lack of evidence and fear of retaliation. The accumulation of these small incidents, however, began to shape a picture of a man whose private behavior did not match his public image. Journalists and local rumor mills also played a role. As more boys went missing, whispers circulated about a contractor with connections to city officials. Neighborhood parents began warning their sons to be careful, though no one yet understood the scale of the danger. In retrospect, these murmurs sound like the prelude to a revelation, but at the time they were scattered, half-believed stories, easy to dismiss in a city full of rumors. Gacy himself seemed aware that the walls were inching closer. He drank more heavily, grew more irritable with employees, and occasionally lashed out. Yet he also doubled down on his public persona, attending even more community events and cultivating friendships with influential people. In a chilling photograph from this era, Gacy stands grinning beside the First Lady of the United States, a security badge pinned to his chest. That image would later horrify the public. The killer clown posing with national leadership. But at the time, it was proof of his reach, a talisman of untouchability. Despite his confidence, Gacy's methods were beginning to change. The crawl space was nearly full. He had begun disposing of some bodies in the Des Plaines River, a messier, riskier process that left more evidence for investigators. This shift signaled not only his compulsion's escalation but also its unsustainability. He could no longer manage the secret graveyard beneath his house, and with each new crime, the chance of exposure increased. The stage was set for a collision between Gacy's carefully crafted image and the growing determination of detectives and grieving families. For years, he had hidden in plain sight, relying on society's blind spots and his own charisma. But by late 1978, the pattern of missing boys had become too stark to ignore, and a single disappearance would soon tip the balance, launching the investigation that would unravel everything. The disappearance that would finally push John Wayne Gacy out of the shadows began like so many others, quietly, almost unremarkably. On the evening of December 11, 1978, 15-year-old Robert Piest, a clean-cut high school student from Des Plaines, Illinois, was working at the local pharmacy. He told a coworker he was stepping outside to meet a contractor who might offer him a higher-paying job. That contractor was John Wayne Gacy. Robert never returned. This single event, mundane at first glance, would become the crack that splintered Gacy's double life. Robert's mother knew her son's habits. He was a responsible teenager, not prone to disappearing. When he failed to come home that night, she immediately called the police. Unlike some of Gacy's earlier victims, Robert came from a stable family that demanded answers. Detectives from Des Plaines quickly learned that the contractor Robert had gone to meet was Gacy. They visited him within hours of the report. Gacy was friendly and cooperative, claiming he knew nothing about the boy's whereabouts. He even allowed officers a cursory look around his house, confident that his sealed crawl space and carefully concealed evidence would protect him. But the investigators were different this time. Des Plaines police had been modernizing their procedures and had developed a sharper sense of patterns in missing persons cases. They noted Gacy's prior conviction for sexually assaulting a teenage boy in Iowa, a fact not widely known in Chicago. They also found it suspicious that he was the last person to see Robert alive. For the first time, Gacy was not just a name on a list but a prime suspect. Surveillance on Gacy began almost immediately. 2 detectives were assigned to follow him around the clock. They watched him go to work, visit friends, and attend community events. They noted the odd hours he kept and the young men who seemed to drift in and out of his orbit. Meanwhile, forensic teams began quietly collecting evidence. They searched Robert's belongings at the pharmacy and found a slip of paper with Gacy written on it. They checked Gacy's criminal record. They interviewed his employees, many of whom told unsettling stories about their boss's behavior. Gacy, for his part, alternated between charm and irritation. He invited the surveillance team into restaurants, bought them coffee, and tried to win them over with jokes. He even complained that the attention was ruining his business and reputation. But under the surface, his composure was fraying. He was drinking heavily, sleeping little, and lashing out at friends. The double life he had maintained for years was becoming untenable under the constant gaze of law enforcement as detectives built their case. They began to uncover a disturbing accumulation of circumstantial evidence. A ring belonging to another missing youth was traced back to Gacy. Items linked to several disappearances turned up in his possession. Witnesses described his handcuff trick and his tendency to invite boys into his home. Each piece alone might not have been enough for an arrest, but together they painted a picture too dark to ignore. The Des Plaines police became convinced they were dealing not just with a predator, but with a man responsible for multiple murders. During this time, Gacy tried to maintain his routines. He still hosted social gatherings and spoke with city officials, as if normalcy could act as a shield. But his behavior grew increasingly erratic. He confided to friends that he was going crazy and spoke cryptically about his past. In later interviews, detectives would recall how the confident contractor they first met in December 1978 began to unravel over the following days. A man who sensed the inevitable but still clung to his facade. This phase of the investigation revealed just how much society had changed since Gacy's first offenses. In the 1960s, a single complaint about sexual assault could be brushed aside or lost in bureaucracy. By the late 1970s, a determined local police department could, with persistence and coordination, build a case even against a well-connected citizen. Forensic science was still rudimentary compared to today, but police work was becoming more systematic. Gacy had relied on the blind spots of the system. Now those blind spots were shrinking. The tension of December 1978 built like a thriller. Surveillance officers reported seeing Gacy drive erratically, speed through intersections, and disappear for hours at night. They followed him into bars and diners, where he tried to engage them in small talk. They watched him visit the river, an ominous sign in hindsight. Meanwhile, detectives prepared search warrants, gathering the legal tools they would need to pry open the secrets beneath his house. Robert Pius' case was the keystone. His family's insistence on answers kept pressure on the department. Unlike earlier victims whose disappearances had been quietly filed away, Robert's story remained on the front burner. Every hour that passed without his return deepened suspicion. And unlike many of Gacy's previous victims, Robert left a paper trail, a witness at the pharmacy, a note with Gacy's name, a clear timeline of events. It was the kind of case that could pierce a predator's mask as the holiday season approached. The contrast between Gacy's public image and the investigation closing in on him became stark. On one hand, he was still the man who donned a clown suit to cheer children, the neighbor who lent tools, the businessman who promised jobs. On the other, he was now the focal point of a secret police operation, his every move logged, his home about to become the scene of one of the most infamous excavations in American criminal history. This was the moment when Gacy's narrative shifted from hidden predator to hunted man. For years, he had defined the terms of his double life, deciding who saw what and when. Now the investigators were in control, and each day of surveillance tightened the noose. The boy who had once cowered under his father's hand had grown into a man who terrorized others, but the same overconfidence that fueled his crimes was blinding him to the inevitability of his capture. The disappearance of Robert Piest would not just lead to Gacy's arrest. It would also expose the scale of his atrocities, forever altering the way America thought about monsters who look like neighbors. In the next stage of the story, the facade would crack completely, and the world would discover what lay beneath the floors of 8213 West Summerdale Avenue. Chapter 5: Beneath the Surface. The horrific discovery, when law enforcement finally focused their attention on John Wayne Gacy in late December 1978, few could have imagined what they were about to uncover. The investigation had been meticulous, painstakingly building a case around Gacy's interactions with Robert Piest and the mounting list of missing young men. Surveillance teams had documented his movements, interviews had established timelines, and suspicions had crystallized into probable cause. What followed would not only shock the immediate community but the entire nation. The initial warrant to search Gacy's home was executed with caution. Officers approached the modest suburban house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue as if entering a crime scene poised on the edge of revelation. From the outside, the home appeared ordinary. A small lawn, well-kept shrubs, a driveway with a few parked cars. Christmas decorations still adorned the eaves, and the faint smell of cooking lingered. Inside, Gacy greeted the detectives with the practiced charm of years spent deceiving friends, neighbors, and officials alike. He offered coffee, cracked jokes, and answered questions as if he had nothing to hide. But beneath the surface lay a reality far more sinister. As officers began examining the crawl space under the house, the first signs of what Gacy had concealed for years became apparent. Shovels, plastic sheeting, and disturbed earth hinted at the unthinkable. When investigators started digging, they uncovered human remains carefully wrapped and buried. A ghastly tableau that was both methodical and chillingly personal. Each body revealed the brutal reality of Gacy's crimes. Young men, bound and restrained, victims of strangulation, many sexually assaulted prior to death. The scale of the discovery stunned even veteran officers. What had begun as a missing teenager's case escalated almost immediately into a serial murder investigation. Bodies continued to be unearthed in the crawl space, stacked methodically in the trenches Gacy had previously dug under the guise of home improvements. It was a level of premeditation and concealment that spoke not just to cunning but to a meticulous, cold-blooded mindset. Every detail, wrapping the bodies in plastic, using lime to mask odor, careful layering, demonstrated a macabre foresight, a terrifying devotion to secrecy. Gacy's home became the epicenter of one of the most extensive forensic excavations of the era. Detectives worked around the clock, cataloging evidence, photographing remains, and ensuring every fragment was preserved. Each recovered body provided crucial insight into his methods, his choice of victims, and the disturbing rituals that accompanied his killings. The handcuff trick, the lure of jobs, the social manipulation, all patterns identified by investigators revealed a man who had weaponized charm, opportunity, and societal trust. The psychological profile emerging from the investigation painted a portrait of a man whose duality was complete. Above ground, Gacy remained the civic-minded contractor, the smiling neighbor, the clown adored by children. Below ground, he was a methodical killer, calculating, opportunistic, and increasingly overconfident. Experts later noted that this level of compartmentalization required not only intelligence but a profound detachment from empathy and guilt. Gacy had created two entirely separate realities and managed to inhabit them simultaneously for years. Media coverage of the discovery escalated rapidly. Reporters flooded the neighborhood, capturing photographs of the suburban facade behind which such horrors had been concealed. Public fascination was immediate. How could a man so seemingly ordinary, so outwardly generous, have committed such atrocities? The concept of the killer clown emerged, both horrifying and surreal, emphasizing the stark contrast between Gacy's public persona and his private crimes. The photographs of him in costume, now paired with evidence of murder, became emblematic of his duplicity. The forensic team faced challenges unlike any they had previously encountered. Many bodies were decomposed, requiring painstaking identification methods. Investigators relied on dental records, personal effects, clothing remnants, and even unique anatomical markers to determine the identities of Gacy's victims. Each identification carried a weight of grief for families who had spent years wondering about their missing sons, brothers, and friends. The realization that their loved ones had been preyed upon, often for months or years, added a profound emotional dimension to the investigation. Gacy himself remained outwardly cooperative, at least superficially. He answered questions, sometimes laughing at suggestions, maintaining the mask he had perfected over decades. Yet subtle shifts in his behavior hinted at cracks in that mask. Observers noted fleeting expressions of tension, hands shaking slightly, and a tightening of facial muscles, small betrayals of the storm brewing within. These moments, brief though they were, offered investigators glimpses of the internal conflict and fear that had remained hidden for so long that as the excavation progressed. The sheer horror of the crime scene underscored the magnitude of Gacy's deception. Neighbors and friends could scarcely reconcile the man they had known with the reality unearthed beneath their feet. The duality that had allowed Gacy to live openly in the community while killing in secret became a subject of intense scrutiny for psychologists, criminologists, and the public. Scholars would later analyze Gacy as a textbook case of a socially adept psychopath, capable of charm and manipulation, yet utterly devoid of empathy, with a singular focus on satisfying dark compulsions. Each new revelation about the crawl space further complicated the investigation. Detectives documented every body meticulously, noting position, evidence of restraint, and cause of death. Patterns emerged that confirmed Gacy's methodical approach. Most victims were lured with offers of employment, alcohol, or drugs, restrained through handcuffs or ligatures, and murdered using strangulation techniques he had practiced repeatedly. The documentation provided crucial insight not only into Gacy's methods but into the psychology of organized serial killers operating in close proximity to unsuspecting communities. The weeks that followed the initial discovery turned Gacy's house into a national focal point. Forensic teams worked tirelessly, documenting every inch of the crawl space, examining every tool, recording every anomaly. The public learned, often in graphic detail, the extent to which a man could hide monstrous acts beneath a veneer of normalcy. What had begun as a case of a missing teenager escalated into a profound study of duplicity, manipulation, and the terrifying potential for evil to exist alongside ordinary life. As the investigation into John Wayne Gacy's crimes deepened, the enormity of what lay beneath 8213 West Summerdale Avenue became increasingly clear. Law enforcement worked methodically, uncovering body after body from the cramped crawl space beneath the house. The space was no longer just a hiding place. It had become a crypt, a dark repository for the lives Gacy had stolen. Each trench revealed more than the physical remains of victims. It exposed the terrifying efficiency of a man who had perfected the art of concealment over years of careful planning. For investigators, the scene was unlike any they had previously encountered. Gacy had arranged his victims in ways that minimized detection and maximized concealment. Many bodies were wrapped in plastic sheeting and layered in shallow graves, sometimes sprinkled with lime or other chemicals to reduce odor. The organization of the space suggested meticulous forethought. Each detail, placement, orientation, covering, indicated an offender not acting on whimsy but executing a deliberate, rehearsed strategy. It was an unsettling revelation that underscored the chilling combination of intelligence and remorselessness in Gacy's psyche. One of the most disturbing aspects of the discovery was the variety of victims. They were young men and boys, many between the ages of 14 and 21, drawn from different neighborhoods but often connected by vulnerability. Runaways, youths seeking employment, or those from broken families. This pattern demonstrated Gacy's ability to identify and exploit weaknesses. He sought individuals who would not trigger immediate investigation, further illustrating the calculated nature of his crimes. Each excavation added new names to the roster of the missing, creating a growing sense of horror and urgency. The investigative process required extraordinary coordination. Officers from multiple jurisdictions collaborated, cataloging evidence, interviewing witnesses, and comparing reports of missing persons. Forensic technicians meticulously recorded every item found with the bodies, from clothing and personal effects to dental remains and even small trinkets. Identification was painstaking. Many victims had been missing for months or years, and decomposition complicated the task. Yet through diligent cross-referencing and methodical examination, authorities gradually reconstructed a picture of Gacy's murderous career. As the media began to report on the ongoing investigation, public reaction oscillated between disbelief and revulsion. Headlines highlighted the duality that had allowed Gacy to evade suspicion for so long. The smiling clown at children's parties versus the methodical killer beneath his house. Community members who had once praised him for volunteer work and neighborhood engagement grappled with cognitive dissonance. The story shattered the comforting notion that monstrous acts could only come from outsiders or socially alien individuals. Here was a man who had lived among them, laughed with them, and gained their trust, all while committing atrocities in secret. Psychologists and criminologists later examined the case as a textbook study of organized psychopathy. Gacy's ability to compartmentalize, to maintain a socially acceptable facade while engaging in systematic murder, highlighted the terrifying capabilities of certain criminal minds. He understood the importance of appearances, leveraging charm, civic involvement, and clown personas to disarm suspicion. At the same time, he meticulously planned the capture, restraint, and disposal of victims. The combination of public charisma and private brutality made him extraordinarily difficult to detect, even as the number of victims increased. During the excavation, investigators also found traces of the techniques Gacy had used to subdue his victims. The infamous handcuff trick was revealed to be more than a mere gimmick. It was a tool of coercion, a mechanism that allowed him to restrain his prey without immediate resistance. Items like ropes, belts, and other ligatures confirmed that his methods were systematic. This reinforced the perception that Gacy's crimes were not opportunistic outbursts but the product of careful planning, rehearsal, and refinement over years. Families of victims, some of whom had waited for years for news, faced unimaginable grief as remains were identified. Each discovery brought closure but also intensified the horror. Interviews with surviving family members revealed a mixture of relief, sorrow, and anger. The realization that a trusted neighbor, a civic volunteer, and even a man who entertained children could harbor such darkness was profoundly unsettling. The personal and societal implications of the case reverberated beyond Chicago, shaping the way America perceived serial killers and the dangers that could lurk in ordinary lives. Gacy himself, during this period, remained under constant observation. Investigators noted subtle changes in his demeanor. Moments of unease, flickers of anger, and occasional confessions couched in jest or sarcasm. Though outwardly cooperative, his psychology was unraveling. The meticulous structure of his double life, which had allowed him to evade capture for so long, could no longer sustain the pressure of scrutiny, media attention, and mounting evidence. By the time the final body was unearthed from beneath the house, the enormity of Gacy's crimes had crystallized. Investigators had recovered at least 29 bodies from the crawl space and additional victims from the river. Each finding reinforced the same haunting reality. Gacy's entire life had been a study in duplicity, charm, and cold-blooded calculation. The juxtaposition of the cheerful clown performing for children and the predator hiding below created an image that would haunt both public consciousness and criminal psychology for decades. The discovery beneath Summerdale Avenue marked a turning point not only in the investigation but in the collective understanding of serial crime. It revealed the terrifying potential for evil to exist behind normal appearances, the meticulous planning possible in a socially integrated offender, and the consequences of societal blind spots regarding vulnerable populations. It also set the stage for Gacy's eventual trial, conviction, and the profound national reckoning with the concept of the killer next door. Chapter 6: The Arrest and Initial Interrogation. The arrest of John Wayne Gacy in December 1978 marked a pivotal moment in one of the most chilling criminal cases in American history. After years of predatory behavior carefully hidden behind a veneer of charm and civic involvement, Gacy's double life came crashing down. The catalyst was the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest, whose case finally galvanized police into action. The meticulous investigation, the surveillance, and the mounting pattern of missing young men had all converged to create a moment of reckoning that would forever alter public perception of the suburban predator. When detectives approached Gacy's home, it was under the guise of routine questioning. They knocked on the front door, which opened to reveal the same cheerful, well-groomed man who had entertained children and hosted neighborhood events. He greeted officers warmly, offering coffee and jokes, projecting a calm, cooperative demeanor. Yet beneath the surface, Gacy was aware that this visit was different. Unlike previous casual inquiries, these officers were focused, methodical, and armed with sufficient suspicion to pursue a thorough search. The mask of the affable neighbor, so carefully maintained for years, was about to be shattered. The initial entry into the house set the stage for the investigation's dramatic escalation. Detectives began with visible areas: living room, kitchen, office spaces. They asked routine questions about Robert Piest's interactions and about the whereabouts of other young men connected to Gacy. Each answer from Gacy was delivered with practiced ease, often accompanied by laughter or minor deflection. Yet officers remained vigilant. They had identified inconsistencies in his statements and noted behavioral cues suggestive of deception: subtle fidgeting, fleeting expressions of irritation, and the occasional avoidance of eye contact. The next step was crucial: securing a warrant to search the crawl space beneath the house. This required legal precision and patience. Investigators had to demonstrate probable cause based on patterns of disappearances, witness statements, and circumstantial evidence connecting Gacy to multiple victims. Once the warrant was granted, law enforcement was able to conduct a systematic excavation, a process that would reveal the horrifying extent of his crimes. What unfolded beneath the house was beyond anything investigators had anticipated. Trenches and makeshift graves contained the remains of dozens of young men. Bodies were wrapped in plastic, often accompanied by personal effects, and carefully arranged to maximize concealment. The meticulous organization suggested premeditation, planning, and a chilling attention to detail. For detectives, the scene offered both grim confirmation of Gacy's guilt and insight into his methods. His use of restraints, the targeted selection of vulnerable victims, and the systematic burial practices that had allowed him to evade detection for so long. Gacy's initial interrogation was a study in psychological manipulation. He oscillated between charm, feigned ignorance, and subtle threats. At times he laughed off questions as absurd. At others he attempted to intimidate officers with insinuations about political connections and legal maneuvering. This behavior demonstrated the same traits that had allowed him to maintain his double life for years: intelligence, social awareness, and the ability to mask inner turmoil. Yet, in the controlled environment of the interrogation room, these traits began to unravel. The sustained scrutiny and mounting evidence forced cracks in the persona he had so carefully curated. Detectives soon realized that Gacy's crimes were not isolated incidents but part of a disturbing pattern of serial predation. Interviews with former employees, friends, and acquaintances revealed stories of uncomfortable encounters, sexual propositions, and unexplained disappearances of young men who had been in his orbit. The handcuff trick, previously dismissed as a harmless party gag, emerged as a consistent method of restraint. Each corroborating testimony painted a picture of a man whose public charm was inseparable from private menace. The psychological dynamics of the interrogation were complex. Experienced officers observed that Gacy exhibited traits consistent with psychopathy: superficial charm, grandiosity, manipulativeness, and lack of genuine remorse. He could articulate explanations for his actions without displaying emotion, deflect blame onto societal failings, or recount details of his interactions with victims in a manner that suggested detachment rather than guilt. In short, the interrogation confirmed what the evidence already suggested. Gacy was a highly organized, calculating offender whose ability to compartmentalize allowed him to straddle two realities simultaneously. Even as detectives pieced together the evidence, Gacy maintained an air of confidence in public. Photographs taken during his arrest showed a man in handcuffs, yet still composed, still projecting the calm demeanor of a man in control. The contrast between the horror uncovered beneath his house and the composed exterior he maintained even during arrest reinforced the unnerving notion of the predator hidden in plain sight. It was this very contrast, charming volunteer by day, serial killer by night, that would define his legacy and dominate media narratives in the years to follow. The initial interrogation set the tone for Gacy's legal proceedings. Investigators meticulously documented his statements, noting inconsistencies and contradictions, and began building a case that would eventually encompass the full scale of his murders. Forensic experts analyzed the recovered remains, establishing timelines, causes of death, and methods of restraint. Every element of the case, from witness testimony to physical evidence, pointed toward a single conclusion. John Wayne Gacy had lived a life of duplicity so complete that his community, his colleagues, and even law enforcement had been deceived for years. By the end of those first days in custody, Gacy's world had shifted irreversibly. The careful balance he had maintained between social acceptance and predation was shattered. Above ground, the smiling clown, the diligent contractor, and the civic-minded neighbor no longer had control. Below ground, the evidence of his crimes lay exposed for the world to see. In the weeks and months that followed, the full scope of Gacy's atrocities would be cataloged, examined, and eventually presented in court. An indictment not only of a single man but of the vulnerabilities inherent in social trust, systemic blind spots, and the terrifying potential for evil to exist behind ordinary faces. Following his arrest, John Wayne Gacy was transferred to a secure holding facility where he underwent extensive interrogation sessions. Unlike typical criminal interrogations, these were prolonged, detailed, and psychologically intense. Investigators had to navigate Gacy's manipulative tendencies, his superficial charm, and his uncanny ability to feign ignorance. Every question posed to him became a test of patience and persistence, as officers attempted to peel back layer after layer of deceit. Gacy, aware of the mounting evidence against him, oscillated between deflection and audacious assertions of innocence. At times he laughed outright, dismissing inquiries as ridiculous or overblown. He attempted to portray himself as a victim of circumstance, claiming that people misunderstood his intentions, that allegations were the result of gossip, and that his past legal troubles in Iowa had unfairly tainted his reputation. Yet, beneath the bravado, subtle signs of tension began to emerge. His voice occasionally cracked, and fleeting expressions betrayed anxiety that would soon grow into full-blown psychological pressure. Investigators, experienced in dealing with manipulative offenders, recognized these cues. They knew that patience would be their most valuable tool. By combining evidence from the crawl space, witness testimonies, and Gacy's known criminal history, they methodically confronted him with facts. Each piece of corroborating evidence tightened the net, making Gacy increasingly aware that evasion would be futile. The contrast between the overwhelming physical evidence and his verbal denials began to erode the carefully constructed persona he had maintained for over a decade. Forensic analysis played a crucial role in strengthening the case. Each recovered body was examined to establish identity, cause of death, and the circumstances surrounding the murder. Dental records, personal belongings, and physical anomalies were meticulously catalogued. The patterns that emerged: selection of young males, use of restraints, sexual assault, and burial in the crawl space, confirmed the organized and premeditated nature of Gacy's crimes. These findings provided a concrete framework within which investigators could challenge Gacy's denials. In many ways, the interrogation sessions became a study in psychological warfare. Gacy attempted to manipulate the process by alternating between cooperation and resistance. He would admit to trivial facts, suggest alternative narratives, or point to perceived procedural errors in an attempt to cast doubt. Investigators countered by presenting him with irrefutable evidence and confronting inconsistencies in his statements. Slowly, the walls of deception began to collapse under the weight of facts and methodical questioning. The public, meanwhile, was captivated by the unfolding drama. Newspapers and television broadcasts sensationalized the case, often focusing on the contrast between Gacy's clown persona and the horrors uncovered in his home. The nickname Killer Clown quickly became emblematic of the duality that defined him, shaping the cultural perception of the case. Yet beneath the media spectacle, law enforcement remained focused on the painstaking work of building a watertight legal case, ensuring that Gacy could be prosecuted for every confirmed murder. During the early stages of interrogation, Gacy occasionally hinted at his compulsions, though always in a detached, clinical manner. He discussed his methodical approach, the pleasure he derived from control, and even the concealment strategies he had employed to avoid detection. These statements, while partial and often self-serving, offered crucial insight into his psychological makeup. Criminologists later used these revelations to analyze his behavioral patterns, providing valuable understanding of organized serial offenders who operate in plain sight. The process also revealed Gacy's overconfidence and misjudgment. He had underestimated the persistence of law enforcement, the dedication of grieving families, and the power of coordinated forensic investigation. For years, he had relied on social charm, community goodwill, and systemic blind spots to evade scrutiny. Now, faced with relentless evidence and psychological pressure, he could no longer control the narrative. The arrogance that had once protected him became a liability, exposing him to inevitable legal consequences. By the conclusion of these initial interrogations, it was evident that John Wayne Gacy's carefully constructed double life had collapsed. Above ground, he could no longer maintain the facade of the civic-minded clown and contractor. Below ground, the evidence of his crimes had been documented and preserved, leaving him with no room for deception. The stage was set for a legal battle that would not only hold him accountable but also capture national attention, highlighting the terrifying potential for predators to hide behind ordinary appearances. Gacy's arrest and interrogation thus represented a turning point, both in the investigation and in the broader understanding of serial predation. Law enforcement, having painstakingly reconstructed years of criminal activity, had managed to pierce the veil of normalcy that Gacy had so expertly cultivated. The subsequent legal proceedings would confront the public with the grim reality of his actions, forcing society to reconcile the dissonance between the friendly, smiling neighbor and the calculated, remorseless killer. The meticulous work of those early interrogations ensured that justice could proceed, setting the foundation for a trial that would become one of the most notorious in American criminal history. Investigators had not only gathered evidence and secured confessions, but had also mapped the psychological architecture of a man whose life of deception had terrorized a community. In doing so, they provided a template for understanding and preventing similar patterns of organized predation in the future. Chapter 7: The trial begins. A nation watches in horror. The trial of John Wayne Gacy began in February 1980, and from the moment it commenced, it captured the attention of the nation. For the first time, the public would confront the full scale of his crimes, the horrifying duality of a man who had lived a seemingly ordinary life while secretly preying upon dozens of young men. Gacy's courtroom became a stage where the darkest aspects of human behavior were laid bare, forcing society to grapple with questions of trust, evil, and the psychological depths of a calculated predator. The proceedings were complex and meticulously organized. Prosecutors faced the challenge of presenting overwhelming evidence without alienating jurors, who had to comprehend the magnitude of Gacy's crimes while maintaining a sense of objectivity. The case encompassed 33 counts of murder, along with related charges of sexual assault and unlawful restraint. Forensic evidence, witness testimonies, and Gacy's own prior criminal record formed the backbone of the prosecution, while the defense sought to challenge credibility, intent, and the interpretation of evidence. From the outset, Gacy's behavior in the courtroom drew attention. He arrived well-groomed, composed, and, true to form, occasionally attempted charm, addressing the court with calm confidence. He wore suits that projected respectability, a stark contrast to the monstrous acts being detailed by prosecutors. Observers noted the juxtaposition. The man who could entertain children as Pogo the Clown now sat before a judge and jury accused of acts so horrific that they challenged comprehension. The image of normalcy colliding with atrocity would become one of the defining elements of the trial in the public consciousness. The prosecution meticulously outlined the evidence. Forensic experts described the conditions under which the bodies were discovered in Gacy's home, detailing the use of restraints, the methodical burials, and the plastic wrappings designed to conceal evidence. Witnesses testified about Gacy's interactions with young men, corroborating patterns of luring, restraining, and ultimately murdering his victims. Employees described inappropriate advances, manipulation, and unusual behaviors, all painting a portrait of a man whose public persona masked a predatory life. One of the key pieces of evidence presented was Gacy's own statements and actions leading up to and following his arrest. Surveillance records, witness reports, and documented inconsistencies in his story were highlighted to demonstrate consciousness of guilt. The prosecution emphasized the planning and deliberate concealment involved, portraying a methodical offender who understood the consequences of his actions yet persisted in committing them. Each detail reinforced the characterization of Gacy as an organized, calculating serial killer. The defense, meanwhile, faced an uphill battle. They attempted to argue diminished responsibility, suggesting that Gacy's mental state impaired his judgment and understanding of right and wrong. Psychiatrists brought in by the defense testified about his personality disorders, offering interpretations that framed Gacy as suffering from compulsion and mental instability. Yet these arguments struggled against the weight of physical evidence, survivor testimonies, and the meticulous records left behind by the forensic team. The organized nature of the crimes, targeting vulnerable young men, maintaining secrecy, and manipulating social perceptions, made the argument of diminished capacity difficult to substantiate. Media coverage amplified the drama, broadcasting images of Gacy both as the smiling clown and as the accused serial killer. Public fascination was intense, fueled by the surreal contrast of his cheerful public image and the horrific details emerging from the courtroom. Discussions ranged from criminological analysis to moral outrage, with psychologists, journalists, and citizens debating how a man so integrated into his community could have carried out such atrocities undetected for years. The term killer clown became a symbol, capturing the essence of his duplicitous existence and ensuring that the case would remain etched in American memory. Testimonies from families of victims were particularly harrowing. Parents recounted the anguish of losing their sons and the years spent wondering about their fates. Their statements humanized the statistics, giving faces and stories to the victims whose remains had been recovered from the crawl space and the Des Plaines River. The emotional impact of these testimonies reinforced the gravity of Gacy's actions, reminding the jury that beyond the forensic evidence lay the lives of real individuals whose absence had left enduring scars. Throughout the trial, Gacy remained outwardly calm, occasionally smirking at points that observers found unsettling. His ability to compartmentalize, which had allowed him to commit crimes undetected, now enabled him to navigate the courtroom with a composed facade. Yet subtle cracks appeared. Moments of agitation, fleeting expressions of frustration, and occasional outbursts revealed that the pressure of public scrutiny and detailed prosecution was beginning to affect him. These glimpses into his psychology provided valuable insight for both experts and the public, highlighting the tension between his outward control and inner instability. The trial also introduced jurors and observers to the psychological profile of organized serial killers. Gacy's behavior, meticulous planning, charm, predation on vulnerable individuals, and concealment strategies served as a case study for understanding complex criminal minds. Experts explained how offenders like Gacy exploit societal blind spots, maintain dual lives, and manipulate perceptions to avoid detection. The courtroom became an arena not only for legal proceedings but for examining the interplay of social trust, predatory behavior, and psychological pathology. As the first weeks of the trial concluded, it was clear that this was more than a criminal proceeding. It was a societal reckoning. The nation watched as Gacy's crimes, concealed behind smiles and civic involvement for years, were methodically laid bare. The evidence, testimonies, and expert analyses converged to illustrate the depths of his duplicity and the meticulousness of his predatory life. The trial had become a mirror reflecting both the horror of Gacy's actions and the vulnerabilities within society that had allowed him to operate undetected for so long. As the trial of John Wayne Gacy progressed, the courtroom became a stage where every detail of his double life was scrutinized, analyzed, and presented for public judgment. Prosecutors meticulously walked the jury through the sequence of disappearances, connecting victims by pattern, time, and location. Each testimony reinforced the horrifying portrait of Gacy as a predator who had exploited the trust and innocence of dozens of young men. What was particularly unsettling was the duality that had allowed him to operate undetected for so long. The smiling, community-engaged contractor versus the methodical, remorseless killer lurking beneath the surface. A critical aspect of the trial involved forensic experts who described the conditions in which the bodies were discovered. They detailed the careful wrapping, the use of restraints, and the manner in which Gacy had buried his victims in his crawl space or disposed of some in the Des Plaines River. Every forensic description painted a picture of premeditation. These revelations emphasized that Gacy's murders were not impulsive acts of rage but calculated crimes executed with chilling efficiency. The jury was presented with the methodology of a killer who had refined his craft over years, hiding each act behind the mask of normalcy. Witnesses played a pivotal role in connecting Gacy to his crimes. Former employees recounted unusual incidents, invitations to his home, propositions that were unwelcome, and glimpses of his manipulative tendencies. Neighbors described the man they had known, the friendly, civic-minded contractor who entertained children and volunteered in the community. The contrast between public persona and private criminality was stark, leaving jurors and observers struggling to reconcile the two. Each testimony strengthened the prosecution's narrative. Gacy's crimes were organized, deliberate, and sustained over years. The defense continued to focus on psychological explanations, portraying Gacy as someone compelled by mental disorder rather than moral failing. Psychiatrists testified about his personality traits, citing tendencies toward compulsion and detachment from social norms. However, the weight of physical evidence, bodies, restraints, and witness accounts undermined the argument of diminished responsibility. Gacy's ability to plan, execute, and conceal his crimes demonstrated a level of cognitive function incompatible with a complete loss of moral awareness. The organized nature of his killings indicated forethought and self-control, contradicting claims of impulsive, uncontrollable behavior. Public fascination reached unprecedented levels. Newspapers, television broadcasts, and magazines featured extensive coverage, often emphasizing the surreal aspect of the killer clown. Images of Gacy in costume, juxtaposed with photographs of evidence, created a narrative that was almost cinematic in its horror. Yet beyond sensationalism, the trial served a deeper purpose, educating the public about patterns of predation, the vulnerabilities of young men, and the methods by which manipulative offenders operate. Gacy's story became both a cautionary tale and a subject of intense criminological interest. Emotional testimonies from victims' families added a human dimension to the trial. Parents, siblings, and friends spoke about the missing loved ones, the years of uncertainty, and the enduring grief caused by Gacy's crimes. These accounts reminded jurors that the case was not merely a legal or forensic exercise. It was a confrontation with real lives destroyed. The impact of these narratives was profound, fostering empathy and underscoring the devastating consequences of Gacy's predation. For the families, the trial offered a venue for recognition and acknowledgement of their loss, even as it exposed the depths of their anguish. Gacy's behavior during the trial remained a subject of observation and analysis. While he attempted to maintain composure, there were noticeable fluctuations in demeanor. Occasional smirks, bursts of irritation, and subtle shifts in posture suggested a man struggling to navigate scrutiny he could no longer manipulate. His outward calm belied the internal tension building as witnesses recounted details of his crimes. Forensic evidence was presented, and the jury absorbed the sheer scale of his actions. These glimpses into his psychological state reinforced expert assessments of his manipulative and compartmentalized personality. The trial also highlighted broader societal questions. How could a man so seemingly integrated into the community commit such atrocities undetected for years? What social blind spots and systemic failures had allowed Gacy to target vulnerable young men repeatedly? Criminologists and sociologists analyzed the intersection of social trust, human psychology, and law enforcement practices, using Gacy's case as a framework to understand the dynamics of organized serial predation. The courtroom became a lens through which society examined its own vulnerabilities and assumptions about safety, normalcy, and appearances. As the prosecution moved toward closing arguments, the narrative was clear. John Wayne Gacy had meticulously cultivated a dual life, exploiting societal trust while committing heinous crimes. The evidence, both forensic and testimonial, depicted an offender who was organized, predatory, and terrifyingly methodical. The courtroom had become a stage for exposing this duality, allowing jurors and the public alike to confront the stark reality that evil could wear the face of the familiar and the friendly. By the end of these proceedings, the trial had already left an indelible mark on American society. Gacy's case reshaped the public understanding of serial murder, influencing investigative practices, victim advocacy, and psychological profiling. It forced a confrontation with uncomfortable truths, that charm and normalcy could conceal unimaginable violence, and that vigilance, investigation, and critical observation were essential in protecting vulnerable populations. The courtroom drama of John Wayne Gacy was not only a legal battle but a profound exploration of human psychology, societal trust, and the terrifying potential for darkness hidden in plain sight. Chapter 8: The Prosecution's Case. Detailing the atrocities, as the trial of John Wayne Gacy entered its next phase, the prosecution intensified its efforts to present the full scope of his crimes. Prosecutors understood that they were not merely seeking conviction. They were confronting a man whose actions had shocked the nation and shattered the illusion of suburban safety. The courtroom became a theater for presenting a meticulous narrative, a sequence of events revealing how Gacy had exploited trust, charm, and opportunity to perpetrate his crimes with devastating effect. The prosecution began by detailing the pattern of disappearances, emphasizing that Gacy's victims were predominantly young men, often in vulnerable situations. Witnesses recounted how these young men had been lured with promises of employment, alcohol, or drugs. Each story painted a chilling picture of manipulation. The careful observation of behaviors, the selection of targets unlikely to prompt immediate concern, and the execution of crimes in a manner designed to minimize detection. The evidence illustrated not randomness, but a calculated and persistent predatory strategy. Forensic experts presented the physical evidence recovered from Gacy's home, particularly the crawl space beneath 8213 West Summerdale Avenue. Trenches containing the remains of young men were described in vivid detail. Bodies were often wrapped in plastic sheeting, bound with ligatures, and buried in a precise manner intended to avoid discovery. The level of organization was unprecedented for a case of this era, demonstrating not only premeditation but also a methodical approach to concealment. Each forensic explanation emphasized the systematic nature of the crimes, reinforcing the portrait of a meticulous and remorseless offender. Investigators explained the methods Gacy used to restrain and control his victims. The infamous handcuff trick, initially perceived as a harmless demonstration, was revealed to be a coercive technique, allowing Gacy to immobilize his victims without resistance. Additional restraints included ropes, belts, and various improvised ligatures. Experts testified that Gacy had likely practiced these methods over time, refining his ability to subdue individuals efficiently. This testimony underscored the premeditated, organized nature of his actions, challenging any notion that the murders were impulsive or spontaneous. The prosecution also highlighted the psychological manipulation employed by Gacy. Witnesses described how he used charm, flattery, and feigned mentorship to gain the trust of his victims. He exploited societal expectations, presenting himself as a responsible adult, a civic volunteer, and even as a mentor for young men seeking work or guidance. These strategies allowed him to isolate individuals, draw them into his home, and commit his crimes without immediate detection. The combination of charm and coercion became a central theme in the prosecution's argument, illustrating the sophistication of Gacy's predatory behavior. Testimonies from families of missing youths were particularly impactful. Relatives recounted the distress of unexplained disappearances and the prolonged uncertainty surrounding their loved ones' fates. Their stories humanized the forensic evidence, transforming statistics and timelines into tangible narratives of loss, grief, and devastation. These accounts reinforced the emotional gravity of the case, reminding jurors that behind the evidence lay real lives tragically cut short. The prosecution emphasized the continuity of these disappearances over several years, highlighting Gacy's persistent and deliberate exploitation of opportunity. Gacy's prior criminal history played a significant role in the prosecution's case. His 1968 conviction for sexually assaulting a teenage boy in Iowa provided context for his long-standing predatory tendencies. While some legal experts debated the admissibility of past offenses, prosecutors argued that the history demonstrated a pattern of behavior consistent with the crimes under investigation. The court considered this history as evidence of calculated intent, further challenging any defense narrative of diminished responsibility or impulsive action. The courtroom atmosphere was charged with tension and focus. Observers noted the surreal contrast between Gacy's public image and the horrors being revealed. Photographs of him in his Pogo, the clown costume, were juxtaposed with evidence from his home, reinforcing the duality of his life. The killer clown narrative, sensationalized by the media, had a grounding in the meticulous presentation of facts in court. Jurors were confronted not with abstract horror, but with tangible, documented evidence of deception, violence, and concealment. The prosecution's narrative also emphasized the community's vulnerability. Gacy had exploited societal trust, relying on assumptions about neighborly behavior and the safety of suburban environments. He manipulated norms, presenting himself as a responsible adult and a benefactor to the local community. These insights were critical to understanding both the psychology of the offender and the structural weaknesses that allowed his crimes to go undetected for so long. The trial became an exploration of societal blind spots, highlighting how ordinary appearances could conceal extraordinary malevolence. Throughout the proceedings, Gacy attempted to maintain composure, often responding with charm, sarcasm, or feigned ignorance. Yet, as the prosecution laid out the methodical details of his crimes, subtle fissures in his facade appeared. Observers documented fleeting signs of agitation, the tightening of facial muscles, and moments of irritability, indicators of a man confronting the inescapable weight of evidence. Despite his attempts at manipulation, the structured and detailed presentation of evidence made evasion impossible. By the end of the first weeks of the prosecution's case, the courtroom had become a microcosm of horror, psychology, and law. Gacy's methods, motivations, and manipulation strategies were laid bare. Jurors and observers were forced to confront the terrifying duality of a man who had lived openly in the community while committing heinous crimes in secret. Each detail, meticulously presented, served to build an unassailable case against him, illustrating both the calculated nature of his predation and the broader lessons about vigilance, trust, and the capacity for evil hidden beneath ordinary appearances. As the prosecution continued to present its case against John Wayne Gacy, the depth and scale of his crimes became increasingly apparent. Forensic experts took the stand to explain not just the mechanics of the murders, but also the psychological implications of Gacy's methods. Every detail of the crime scene, from the meticulous arrangement of bodies to the deliberate concealment measures, revealed the terrifyingly methodical mind of a man who had maintained a dual existence for years. Experts testified about the crawl space beneath Gacy's home, describing how he had transformed it into a hidden chamber of horrors. Trenches had been dug and lined, bodies carefully wrapped in plastic sheeting, and restraints applied to prevent movement. Some victims had been buried with layers of soil and chemicals designed to reduce decomposition odors, demonstrating a forethought and cunning that went far beyond simple concealment. Investigators explained that the combination of concealment, organization, and premeditation indicated a highly organized offender, one who was fully aware of the consequences of his actions yet proceeded with deliberate intent. The prosecution emphasized the manipulation techniques Gacy used to ensnare his victims. Young men, often isolated or vulnerable, were approached under the guise of employment opportunities, mentorship, or social companionship. Once invited to Gacy's home, victims were often restrained using handcuffs or improvised ligatures, incapacitating them before assaults. Witness testimonies corroborated the sequence of events, recounting Gacy's charm, flattery, and feigned guidance as instruments of manipulation. The jury was presented with the chilling realization that Gacy had weaponized trust, exploiting societal norms and human kindness to facilitate his crimes. Graphic accounts of Gacy's interactions with victims further illustrated his predatory behavior. Former employees and acquaintances described unsettling incidents, inappropriate propositions, invitations that seemed innocent but carried hidden threats, and manipulative tactics to isolate potential victims. These accounts revealed a man attuned to the vulnerabilities of those around him, adept at identifying individuals who could be controlled or coerced. The combination of charm, manipulation, and physical restraint painted a complete picture of a man operating with calculated precision. The prosecution also addressed Gacy's prior offenses, including his 1968 conviction for sexually assaulting a teenage boy in Iowa. This history demonstrated a long-standing pattern of predation and reinforced the organized, deliberate nature of his crimes. Experts testified that the recurrence of such behavior over more than a decade indicated not a loss of control but a persistent, methodical pursuit of opportunity. The evidence framed Gacy not as impulsive but as an offender with clear intent and understanding of his actions. Family testimonies played a significant role in humanizing the victims. Parents and siblings recounted the agony of missing loved ones, often expressing frustration at the years spent searching for answers. Their words brought an emotional weight to the case, transforming numbers and forensic data into the lived reality of grief, loss, and trauma. The jury was repeatedly reminded that each body uncovered in Gacy's home or the Des Plaines River represented a unique life ended prematurely, reinforcing the seriousness and magnitude of the crimes. Media attention during the trial remained intense. Photographs of Gacy in his Pogo, the clown costume, were frequently juxtaposed with courtroom evidence and family testimonies, reinforcing the surreal and horrifying duality of his existence. The nickname Killer Clown became a cultural touchstone, encapsulating the shocking contrast between the man's public persona and the atrocities he committed in private. Coverage of the trial contributed to widespread public discussion about the nature of serial killers, the vulnerabilities of youth, and the importance of vigilance in community and social networks. Gacy's behavior in court continued to be a subject of observation. While he attempted to maintain calm, Moments of agitation revealed the strain of facing the cumulative weight of evidence. Subtle signs, tightened jaw, restless hands, fleeting glances, betrayed an underlying tension. These behaviors provided experts with additional insights into his psychological profile, further reinforcing the understanding of how he had managed to compartmentalize his violent impulses while maintaining a socially acceptable facade. The prosecution meticulously connected each victim to Gacy, using forensic evidence, witness testimony, and timelines to demonstrate patterns of predation. The careful documentation highlighted not only the sequence of crimes but also the methods employed, reinforcing the organized nature of the killings. The jury was presented with a structured narrative that left little room for ambiguity. Gacy had acted with forethought, intent, and deliberation, exploiting trust and opportunity with lethal precision. By the end of this phase of the trial, the prosecution had successfully established a comprehensive portrait of John Wayne Gacy as a calculating, organized serial killer. The combination of forensic evidence, psychological analysis, and victim testimony left a chilling impression on the courtroom and the public. Beyond securing a legal conviction, the trial exposed broader truths about societal vulnerabilities, the psychology of predation, and the unsettling reality that monstrous acts can be hidden beneath seemingly ordinary appearances. The meticulous detailing of Gacy's atrocities transformed the trial into a profound exploration of human behavior, morality, and the fragility of trust. Jurors were compelled to confront the deliberate nature of the crimes, the premeditation, and the horrifying duality that had allowed Gacy to live among neighbors, friends, and families while committing acts of unimaginable cruelty. The courtroom narrative illuminated both the specifics of his crimes and the broader lessons to be learned about vigilance, awareness, and the complexities of human deception. Chapter 9: Defense Strategies and the Mental Health Debate. As the trial of John Wayne Gacy progressed into its middle phases, the focus shifted toward the defense's strategy. Attorneys faced the daunting task of countering a prosecution fortified with extensive forensic evidence, survivor and witness testimonies, and Gacy's own documented criminal history. Their approach centered on challenging the interpretation of evidence, exploring the nuances of Gacy's mental state, and questioning the degree to which his psychological profile might have influenced his actions. The defense's tactics became a critical point of discussion, offering a window into both the legal and psychological complexities of serial crime cases. One of the primary pillars of the defense was the assertion that Gacy suffered from significant mental health disturbances that impaired his judgment. Psychiatrists called to testify argued that he exhibited traits of severe personality disorders, including tendencies toward compulsion, detachment, and manipulative behavior. These experts suggested that Gacy's mental state diminished his capacity to fully comprehend the moral implications of his actions. They emphasized that, while his acts were undeniably criminal, they were driven in part by internal compulsions beyond his conscious control. The defense also highlighted Gacy's outward conformity to societal norms, portraying him as a man capable of social integration despite his psychological challenges. They argued that his ability to maintain employment, volunteer in civic organizations, and engage positively with neighbors indicated a level of functioning inconsistent with premeditated, rational criminal behavior. The strategy was to suggest that his organized facade was the product of psychological dissonance rather than deliberate deception. Defense attorneys maintained that while Gacy's actions were horrendous, the case raised complex questions about accountability, compulsion, and the extent to which mental health issues mitigated responsibility. In court, the defense frequently referenced Gacy's past history of trauma and personal challenges. Witnesses described his turbulent childhood, including experiences with parental conflict, social isolation, and early behavioral problems. The defense argued that these formative experiences contributed to the development of maladaptive coping mechanisms, distorted perceptions of relationships, and an enduring pattern of antisocial behavior. By contextualizing his criminality within a lifetime of psychological stressors, they aimed to provide jurors with a framework for understanding his actions beyond mere malevolence. The prosecution countered these arguments by emphasizing the organized, premeditated nature of Gacy's crimes. Forensic evidence demonstrated meticulous planning, careful concealment, and deliberate manipulation of victims, all inconsistent with a complete lack of rational control. Witness testimonies revealed patterns of grooming, coercion, and targeted selection of vulnerable individuals, further undermining claims of diminished responsibility. Prosecutors argued that Gacy's ability to evade detection for years required cognitive awareness, strategic thinking, and a sustained effort to maintain a dual life, all incompatible with the notion of impaired judgment. One particularly striking aspect of the defense's approach was its reliance on psychiatric testimony regarding Gacy's compulsions. Experts discussed how Gacy reportedly felt driven to commit acts he could not fully resist, framing his behavior in the context of psychological compulsion rather than calculated malice. This testimony was intended to humanize Gacy to some extent, positioning him as a man caught between moral awareness and irresistible impulses. However, cross-examinations highlighted contradictions. The calculated selection of victims, the methodical disposal of bodies, and the conscious avoidance of detection all indicated deliberate intent rather than uncontrollable compulsion. Throughout these proceedings, the courtroom became a battleground for competing narratives. On one side was the prosecution, presenting a meticulous and comprehensive account of premeditated serial killings. On the other was the defense, emphasizing psychological complexity, mental health considerations, and the potential mitigating influence of personality disorders. Jurors were tasked with navigating this tension, weighing evidence against testimony, and determining the extent to which psychological factors might influence legal culpability. The media closely followed the mental health debate, often sensationalizing it for public consumption. News coverage focused on the dichotomy of the killer clown image and discussions of compulsion and personality disorder, creating a complex narrative that combined elements of psychology, criminal investigation, and societal fascination. Public interest in the case deepened as discussions of Gacy's mental state prompted broader conversations about criminal responsibility, the role of psychological evaluation in legal proceedings, and the capacity of the justice system to account for mental health in extreme cases of serial murder. The defense also sought to challenge procedural aspects of the prosecution's case, questioning the integrity of evidence handling, witness credibility, and the chain of custody for forensic materials. Attorneys attempted to create doubt about whether all recovered evidence could be reliably attributed to Gacy, and whether his statements had been obtained under conditions consistent with legal standards. While these strategies were standard in high-profile cases, the overwhelming weight of corroborated evidence ultimately limited their effectiveness. As the trial continued, psychological experts provided detailed analyses of Gacy's behavioral patterns. They highlighted his ability to compartmentalize, maintain social facades, and manipulate perception skills often associated with high-functioning psychopaths. The interplay between these traits and the defense's arguments regarding compulsion created a complex portrait. A man whose outward normalcy masked extreme internal pathology, capable of both charm and terror. These expert analyses became a critical reference point for understanding not only Gacy himself but the broader phenomenon of organized, socially integrated serial offenders. By the conclusion of this phase, it was evident that the defense's strategy had two primary objectives: contextualize Gacy's actions within a framework of mental health and psychological compulsion, and introduced doubt about the degree to which his crimes reflected deliberate, rational intent. While these arguments raised profound questions about human psychology, the prosecution's carefully documented evidence of planning, manipulation, and concealment provided a counterweight that jurors would need to consider carefully. The defense's presentation in the trial of John Wayne Gacy delved deeper into the psychological complexities of the accused, aiming to convince the jury that mental health considerations should influence the determination of criminal responsibility. Experts expanded upon the earlier testimony, exploring not only Gacy's compulsive tendencies, but also his capacity for dissociation, emotional detachment, and manipulation. They argued that Gacy's ability to maintain a dual life, as a respected community member and a serial predator, was indicative of underlying psychological disorders rather than pure malice. Psychiatrists described behaviors consistent with antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy. They highlighted Gacy's superficial charm, manipulative tendencies, lack of genuine empathy, and ability to deceive both peers and authorities. At the same time, they noted episodes of internal conflict, tension, and psychological strain when confronted with scrutiny, suggesting that some aspects of his criminal behavior were driven by compulsive needs rather than entirely rational decision-making. These analyses aim to provide jurors with a nuanced understanding of his mental state, emphasizing complexity over simplistic judgments of evil. The defense also introduced testimonies regarding Gacy's childhood and early experiences. They detailed a turbulent home environment marked by parental conflict, strict discipline, and social isolation. Experts posited that these early influences contributed to maladaptive coping mechanisms, difficulties with interpersonal relationships, and the development of antisocial tendencies. By presenting this context, the defense sought to frame Gacy's behavior as the product of both nature and nurture, suggesting that his crimes emerged from a complex interplay of psychological vulnerability and environmental factors. In addition to psychological arguments, the defense carefully examined procedural elements of the prosecution's case. Attorneys questioned the methods of evidence collection, the handling of forensic materials, and the reliability of witness recollections. They sought to create reasonable doubt regarding whether all recovered evidence could be definitively attributed to Gacy and whether his statements had been obtained under conditions that fully respected legal rights. This dual strategy, combining mental health considerations with legal technicalities, was designed to challenge the certainty of the prosecution's narrative while presenting Gacy as a man constrained by both compulsion and circumstance. Despite these efforts, the prosecution continued to emphasize the organized, premeditated nature of Gacy's actions. Experts explained that the careful selection of victims, the systematic use of restraints, and the meticulous concealment of bodies all demonstrated deliberate intent. Witness testimonies corroborated this portrayal, illustrating a clear pattern of manipulation and control. The prosecution argued that these behaviors were incompatible with claims of diminished responsibility or uncontrolled compulsion, presenting the jury with a stark contrast between psychological theory and observable fact. Media coverage of this phase of the trial amplified public fascination with the mental health debate. Reporters and commentators frequently discussed the psychological profiles being presented, exploring terms like psychopathy, antisocial personality disorder, and compulsive predation. Public discourse extended beyond the courtroom, with discussions of morality, criminal responsibility, and societal vulnerabilities dominating newspapers, television programs, and radio segments. The trial became not only a legal proceeding but also a cultural touchstone for understanding the intersection of psychology and crime. The defense's attempts to humanize Gacy extended to portraying him as a man who occasionally demonstrated vulnerability, insecurity, and inner conflict. Experts highlighted moments during his life when he had experienced rejection, disappointment, or social pressure, suggesting that these experiences may have contributed to distorted behavioral patterns. By emphasizing human complexity, the defense aimed to elicit empathy or at least consideration of mitigating factors, framing Gacy as a tragic figure shaped by circumstance rather than a purely malevolent force. Yet, for the jury, the stark reality of the crimes remained central. The detailed forensic evidence, witness accounts, and corroborating records presented an irrefutable chronology of murders and concealments. Each victim was connected to Gacy through a pattern of predation that left little room for ambiguity. The prosecution's case reinforced that, regardless of psychological factors, the actions were deliberate, sustained, and executed with an awareness of legal and moral boundaries. The contrast between Gacy's outward charm and his horrific private acts remained a persistent theme, emphasizing the chilling duality that had allowed him to evade detection for so long. As the defense concluded its arguments, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Jurors were left to navigate complex questions. To what extent did Gacy's mental state influence his culpability? Could compulsive drives or personality disorders mitigate responsibility for acts of extreme violence? How should the legal system weigh psychological nuance against meticulously documented criminal behavior? These questions were not easily answered, reflecting the inherent tension between law, morality, and psychology in cases of organized, serial predation. The mental health debate ultimately served as both a legal strategy and a lens for understanding broader social implications. Experts' testimony illuminated the psychological mechanisms that enable offenders like Gacy to operate undetected, while also exploring the ways in which human behavior can be shaped by early experiences, trauma, and internal compulsions. The courtroom became an arena for examining the delicate balance between accountability and compassion, between the need for justice and the recognition of complex psychological realities. By the end of this phase, the jury had been exposed to a comprehensive portrait of John Wayne Gacy, a man capable of charm and social integration, yet driven by compulsions and antisocial tendencies that manifested in horrific criminal acts. The trial had laid bare the duality of his existence, the organized precision of his crimes, and the intricate interplay between psychological pathology and deliberate violence. It was a confrontation with the darkest aspects of human behavior, one that would shape public perception, legal precedent, and psychological understanding for years to come. Chapter 10: Jury Deliberations and the Weight of Evidence. As the courtroom proceedings in the John Wayne Gacy trial approached their climax, attention turned to the most critical phase: jury deliberations. The jurors, carefully selected over weeks of voir dire, were tasked with an extraordinary responsibility. They were to weigh an overwhelming body of evidence, reconcile competing narratives of psychological pathology versus premeditated intent, and ultimately determine the fate of a man whose actions had horrified the nation. For all involved, the trial had become more than a legal process. It was an examination of human evil, societal vulnerability, and the limits of moral and legal judgment. The prosecution's case had meticulously outlined Gacy's criminal patterns. Each victim was connected to him through a combination of forensic evidence, witness testimony, and documented behaviors. Investigators had traced disappearances over several years, identifying links between victims and Gacy's known social and professional circles. The crawl space beneath his home, the methods of restraint, and the concealment strategies all demonstrated organization, forethought, and deliberate intent. The prosecution emphasized that these elements painted a portrait of a man who consciously manipulated circumstances to commit repeated acts of violence without detection. Witnesses had provided detailed accounts of Gacy's predatory behavior, describing his charm, coercion, and manipulation. Former employees, acquaintances, and surviving victims recounted incidents of invitation, restraint, and assault, illustrating a calculated method of operation. Forensic experts presented the recovered remains, emphasizing the systematic nature of the killings and the sophistication of concealment strategies. Each piece of evidence reinforced the narrative of an organized, highly intelligent, and methodical offender, capable of maintaining a deceptive public persona while committing atrocities in private. The defense, in contrast, had attempted to contextualize Gacy's actions through the lens of mental health. Psychiatric experts argued that he exhibited traits of antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy, and compulsive behavior. They highlighted his ability to compartmentalize, maintain social facades, and manipulate others as indicative of psychological disturbance rather than purely malicious intent. Testimonies regarding Gacy's childhood, early experiences of trauma, and personality traits sought to present him as a man whose criminal behavior was influenced by deep-seated psychological factors, raising questions about diminished responsibility. During deliberations, jurors faced the challenge of balancing these competing narratives. They were instructed to consider both the legal definition of premeditation and the potential mitigating factors related to mental health. The extensive volume of evidence, including forensic documentation, witness accounts, and psychological analyses, required careful scrutiny and critical thinking. Jurors had to determine whether Gacy's actions were fully intentional, organized, and deliberate, or whether they were influenced by uncontrollable compulsions and mental disorders. The complexity of this task highlighted the unique pressures faced by juries in high-profile serial murder cases. The emotional weight of the trial was compounded by the human dimension of the victims. Families had provided compelling testimonies, describing the grief, uncertainty, and lasting trauma caused by the disappearances of their loved ones. Jurors were confronted not with abstract evidence alone, but with real human suffering, reinforcing the gravity of their decisions. Each victim's story served as a reminder that the trial was about accountability, justice, and acknowledgement of the lives lost to Gacy's predation. Media coverage during this phase of the trial remained intense, reflecting public fascination with both the crimes and the legal proceedings. News outlets frequently highlighted the psychological aspects of the defense, debates about premeditation, and the procedural intricacies of the case. The killer clown image continued to dominate coverage, symbolizing the duality of Gacy's existence. A seemingly ordinary, socially integrated man capable of unimaginable violence. Public attention created additional pressure on the jurors, who were aware that their deliberations were being closely observed by a society eager for justice and resolution. Psychologists and criminologists following the trial emphasized its significance in understanding organized serial offenders. Gacy's case illustrated how an individual could exploit societal trust, manipulate perceptions, and maintain a dual life over years. Experts highlighted the importance of recognizing warning signs, understanding behavioral patterns, and improving investigative methods to prevent similar tragedies. The trial thus served a dual purpose: delivering justice for victims and advancing the broader understanding of predatory behavior and the complexities of criminal psychology. As jurors began their formal deliberations, they were faced with weighing each element of evidence carefully. Forensic findings were scrutinized in detail, witness credibility evaluated, and psychological testimonies weighed against documented actions. Every decision required critical analysis. The timeline of disappearances, the methods of restraint, and the concealment of victims all suggested premeditation. Conversely, the defense's emphasis on compulsive drives, psychological disturbance, and formative trauma demanded careful consideration. The process required jurors to navigate the intersection of fact, law, and human psychology with extraordinary diligence. During these deliberations, jurors were reminded of the legal standards that govern their decision-making. They were instructed to determine whether Gacy had acted with conscious intent, awareness of his actions, and knowledge of their consequences. The burden of proof rested on the prosecution, yet the defense's presentation of psychological complexity introduced nuanced questions about accountability and moral culpability. The weight of these deliberations was immense, reflecting the profound societal and legal stakes involved in assessing the crimes of a serial predator operating under the guise of normalcy. By the conclusion of this initial phase of jury deliberation, it was clear that the task before the jurors was extraordinary. They were being asked to dissect a life defined by a chilling duality, to reconcile the evidence of calculated violence with the arguments of psychological compulsion, and to determine the legal and moral responsibility of a man who had terrorized a community for years. The outcome of their deliberations would not only decide Gacy's fate, but would also leave an enduring mark on public consciousness, legal precedent, and the understanding of serial criminal behavior. The jury's deliberations in the John Wayne Gacy trial were intense and prolonged, reflecting the extraordinary complexity and gravity of the case. Jurors faced the unprecedented task of weighing not only the immense physical evidence and witness testimonies, but also the competing psychological interpretations presented by the defense. Every detail, from the forensic documentation of Gacy's crimes to the psychiatric assessments of his mental state, had to be scrutinized, evaluated, and balanced against legal standards of responsibility, intent, and premeditation. The prosecution's narrative of meticulously planned and executed murders served as the foundation of their argument. Experts had explained that Gacy's victims were carefully selected, often isolated, and subjected to systematic restraint. Forensic analysis of the crawl space and the recovered remains revealed a chillingly methodical pattern, including the wrapping of bodies in plastic, the use of ligatures, and the careful layering of soil to conceal the graves. Each detail reinforced the conclusion that Gacy acted with conscious intent, awareness of the consequences, and deliberate forethought. Witness testimonies provided further insight into his manipulative tactics. Friends, former employees, and surviving acquaintances described how Gacy had cultivated trust and exploited social norms to lure victims. He had leveraged charm, mentorship, and the promise of employment to gain access to young men who were vulnerable, isolated, or seeking guidance. These accounts highlighted a calculated strategy, demonstrating that Gacy's crimes were not impulsive acts of rage but carefully orchestrated offenses carried out over years. The defense's arguments about mental health added complexity to the deliberations. Psychiatrists had testified that Gacy exhibited traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy, including a capacity for manipulation, lack of empathy, and compulsive behaviors. They suggested that these traits contributed to a diminished understanding of right and wrong or, at the very least, impaired control over his impulses. The defense also referenced his tumultuous childhood, highlighting factors such as parental conflict, social isolation, and early behavioral disturbances as influences that may have shaped his pathological tendencies. Jurors were required to navigate these competing perspectives carefully. On one side was the undeniable, methodical pattern of predation supported by forensic evidence and victim testimony. On the other was the nuanced presentation of Gacy's mental health history, compulsive behaviors, and personality disorders. This balancing act demanded critical thinking, deliberation, and a nuanced understanding of both criminal law and psychological science. The juror's role was not only to determine guilt, but also to consider the extent to which psychological factors might mitigate culpability or influence sentencing recommendations. The emotional weight of the trial remained profound. Families of the victims had delivered compelling testimony, conveying grief, anguish, and the enduring trauma caused by the disappearances and murders. Each story humanized the victims, reminding the jury that the abstract evidence represented real lives tragically cut short. The emotional resonance of these accounts added pressure to the deliberations, forcing jurors to confront not only legal questions but moral and ethical considerations. They were weighing the fate of a man accused of horrifying crimes against the pain inflicted on families and the broader societal implications of his actions. Throughout deliberations, jurors reviewed evidence meticulously. They analyzed timelines of disappearances, patterns of behavior, and the methods Gacy used to restrain and dispose of victims. Expert testimonies on psychological and psychiatric factors were revisited, prompting discussion about the role of compulsion versus calculated intent. Forensic details were scrutinized, and witness credibility evaluated. Each element was examined in detail to ensure that the verdict would be both legally sound and morally justifiable. The media closely followed the deliberations, highlighting both the psychological debate and the unprecedented scale of Gacy's crimes. Public fascination was heightened by the killer clown image, which had come to symbolize the eerie duality of his existence. Coverage often focused on the contrast between his outward charm and the monstrous acts revealed in court, reinforcing societal shock and the challenge of comprehending such a dual life. For many, Gacy's case became a lens through which to explore broader themes of human behavior, morality, and societal vulnerability. Psychologists analyzing the trial emphasized that Gacy's duality, the socially integrated, seemingly friendly community member and the predatory serial killer, provided a textbook example of how organized offenders operate. They highlighted the importance of recognizing behavioral warning signs, understanding manipulation strategies, and developing investigative approaches to detect and prevent similar patterns of predation. The trial thus functioned as both a legal proceeding and a case study in criminal psychology, advancing knowledge about the behavior and motives of highly organized serial offenders. As deliberations drew on, the weight of the evidence became increasingly clear. While the defense's arguments about compulsion and psychological disturbance were considered thoughtfully, the jury had to reconcile these with the extensive documentation of calculated, repeated offenses. The meticulous planning, concealment, and manipulation left little room for doubt regarding the premeditated nature of Gacy's actions. Jurors were tasked with integrating the human stories, forensic analysis, and psychological insights into a coherent understanding of his criminality, balancing empathy with legal responsibility. Ultimately, the jury faced a verdict that would determine not only Gacy's fate but also serve as a defining moment in public awareness of serial criminal behavior. Their deliberations reflected the tension between understanding human psychology, weighing mitigating factors, and delivering justice for acts of extreme violence. In assessing Gacy's duality, premeditation, and mental health, the jury was forced to confront some of the darkest facets of human behavior, societal trust, and the mechanisms by which a seemingly ordinary individual could commit unimaginable atrocities in plain sight. Chapter 11: The Verdict Approaches. Public Anxiety and Courtroom Tension. As the deliberations in the John Wayne Gacy trial continued, tension in and around the courtroom reached unprecedented levels. The jurors, secluded for careful consideration of the evidence, were tasked with a decision of extraordinary weight to determine the guilt and, eventually, the sentence of a man whose crimes had horrified the nation. Outside the courthouse, journalists, citizens, and families of the victims anxiously awaited the outcome, aware that the verdict would mark the culmination of a case that had both shocked and fascinated the public for months. Within the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Gacy maintained his outward composure, occasionally interacting with his legal team, though subtle signs betrayed the strain of the proceedings. The months of testimony, forensic demonstrations, psychological evaluations, and detailed witness accounts had left an indelible record. Every juror had been exposed to the duality of Gacy's existence, the affable contractor and clown in public life, contrasted with the predatory serial killer meticulously concealing dozens of victims. The tension between this duality and the evidence of premeditation created a complex mental landscape that jurors had to navigate carefully. The prosecution had left little to chance. They had presented a methodical case, combining forensic evidence with survivor and witness testimonies, along with detailed timelines of disappearances. The jury had been shown the careful concealment of victims in Gacy's crawl space, the methods of restraint, and the precision with which he executed these crimes. The prosecution emphasized his repeated pattern of manipulation, preying on vulnerable young men through charm, false promises, and coercion. This presentation left a chilling impression. A man who had not only committed horrific crimes but had done so in a calculated and deliberate manner over years. The defense, in contrast, sought to provide jurors with a framework to understand Gacy's actions through psychological and psychiatric perspectives. Experts had testified that he displayed traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder and compulsive behavior, suggesting an impaired ability to control impulses and fully comprehend the moral weight of his acts. Testimonies highlighted Gacy's childhood experiences, parental conflict, social isolation, and early patterns of maladaptive behavior as contributing factors to his pathological tendencies. The defense did not deny the crimes but argued that these psychological factors should be considered when assessing culpability and sentencing. Balancing these narratives was no small task. Jurors were instructed to evaluate the evidence critically, to assess the credibility of witnesses, and to weigh the significance of psychological testimony against the meticulous documentation of Gacy's actions. They had to consider whether his actions constituted premeditated murder or whether mitigating factors of mental health and compulsion could influence judgment. The complexity of this deliberation was compounded by the highly emotional nature of the case. Families of victims had provided powerful accounts of grief, loss, and enduring trauma, which brought a deeply human dimension to what might otherwise have been an abstract legal evaluation. Public interest in the case intensified as the verdict neared. Newspapers and television broadcasts provided ongoing coverage, often highlighting the psychological debates and forensic revelations. The killer clown image dominated headlines, encapsulating the surreal and terrifying contrast between Gacy's public persona and his hidden atrocities. Citizens engaged in discussion, speculation, and debate, reflecting a societal fascination with the mind of a serial killer and the mechanisms of justice in high-profile cases. The trial had become both a legal process and a cultural touchstone, offering insights into the darker aspects of human behavior and the vulnerabilities of communities. Legal experts noted that the Gacy trial had profound implications for future cases involving organized serial offenders. The detailed forensic work, coupled with psychological profiling and methodical presentation of evidence, demonstrated the critical importance of combining investigative rigor with expert analysis. The trial highlighted how organized offenders could exploit societal trust, manipulate perceptions, and maintain dual identities for extended periods. By examining Gacy's case, law enforcement, legal professionals, and psychologists gained valuable insights into detection, prevention, and the evaluation of psychological factors in criminal behavior in the courtroom. Subtle signs of Gacy's awareness of the gravity of the situation became increasingly evident. Moments of irritation, fleeting expressions of tension, and interactions with his legal team suggested a man conscious of the consequences. despite attempts to maintain outward calm. Observers noted that the months of scrutiny, testimony, and exposure of his dual life had eroded some of his composed facade, revealing glimpses of a psyche grappling with the enormity of his actions and the impending judgment as jurors continued their deliberations. The procedural framework emphasized careful adherence to legal standards. They were reminded to focus on objective evaluation. Did the evidence demonstrate deliberate, organized, and premeditated murder? Could mitigating psychological factors alter the degree of responsibility or inform sentencing? Each decision required meticulous consideration, weighing human testimony, forensic data, and psychiatric analysis against the principles of justice. The responsibility placed upon the jurors was immense, demanding intellectual rigor, emotional resilience, and ethical reflection. By the end of this phase, the trial had evolved into a multifaceted exploration of human behavior, societal trust, and legal accountability. Gacy's duality, the outwardly respectable, socially integrated individual versus the hidden, methodical predator, had been thoroughly documented, examined, and presented. Jurors were tasked with interpreting this complexity, ensuring that the verdict would reflect both the meticulous evidence of organized murder and the psychological dimensions that framed his behavior. The outcome of their deliberations would not only decide the fate of John Wayne Gacy, but also leave a lasting impact on societal understanding of serial crime, forensic investigation, and the intersection of psychology and law. The tension surrounding the John Wayne Gacy trial reached a crescendo as jurors approached the critical moment of delivering their verdict. Inside the deliberation room, jurors wrestled with the weight of evidence, the harrowing personal accounts of victims' families, and the nuanced psychological arguments presented by the defense. Every piece of forensic data, every witness testimony, and every psychological evaluation had to be carefully assessed. The task was not merely to determine guilt, but to weigh the moral and legal dimensions of a man whose crimes had fundamentally altered the understanding of serial predation in modern America. The prosecution had meticulously reconstructed the timeline of Gacy's predation. From the first confirmed disappearances to the discovery of multiple bodies in his crawl space and the Des Plaines River, the pattern of calculated selection, manipulation, and concealment was unmistakable. Experts explained how he restrained victims, often using handcuffs, ropes, or other devices, then disposed of bodies with careful attention to concealment and decay. This demonstrated a chilling combination of strategic intelligence and callous intent, undermining any notion that his actions were impulsive or uncontrolled. Witnesses reinforced the portrait of a methodical predator. Friends, acquaintances, and former employees recounted Gacy's ability to charm, manipulate, and coerce. He had targeted young men who were isolated, vulnerable, or seeking guidance, using flattery, mentorship, and the promise of employment as lures. Each narrative underscored his awareness of the consequences of his actions, the careful orchestration of interactions, and the deliberate exploitation of societal trust. The jury was confronted with the undeniable reality that Gacy's crimes were not isolated acts of impulsive violence, but a sustained campaign of manipulation and murder. The defense had attempted to challenge this narrative through extensive psychological analysis. Experts described traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy, emphasizing compulsive behaviors and impaired impulse control. Testimonies highlighted Gacy's early experiences of trauma, social isolation, and maladaptive coping, suggesting a long-term pattern of disturbed behavior. The defense argued that these psychological factors might mitigate culpability, presenting Gacy as a man shaped by internal compulsion and environmental influences rather than a purely calculating, malicious actor. However, The prosecution countered with the organized and deliberate nature of the crimes. The forensic record, combined with survivor testimony, demonstrated clear patterns of premeditation. The calculated selection of victims, the meticulous restraint methods, and the concealment of bodies all indicated a level of planning incompatible with impulsive compulsion. Prosecutors emphasized that Gacy's sustained ability to evade detection over years required conscious awareness and strategic thought, reinforcing the argument for full accountability. The deliberation process was further complicated by the emotional weight of the case. Families of victims had conveyed profound grief, loss, and trauma, personalizing the evidence and reminding jurors that each death represented a unique life stolen. The human dimension of the case served as a constant moral backdrop, compelling the jury to balance legal definitions with ethical considerations. Their responsibility was not only to uphold justice in abstract terms, but to honor the lives and suffering of those affected by Gacy's predation. Outside the courthouse, public anxiety was palpable. Media coverage amplified the suspense, providing daily updates on juror activity, expert commentary, and analysis of trial proceedings. The killer clown image persisted in headlines, capturing the public imagination and emphasizing the stark duality of Gacy's existence. Society watched closely, aware that the verdict would not only resolve the fate of one man but also offer broader commentary on law enforcement, forensic investigation, and the capacity of communities to identify and respond to predatory behavior. Legal experts noted that the Gacy trial had broader implications for future cases involving serial offenders. The meticulous presentation of forensic evidence, combined with psychological analysis and detailed witness accounts, created a blueprint for prosecuting organized, high-functioning criminals. The case highlighted the importance of integrating behavioral science into legal strategies, demonstrating how comprehensive investigation and expert testimony could elucidate both motive and method. It also underscored the challenges jurors face when confronted with cases of extreme duality. Individuals capable of both social integration and hidden predation. As deliberations progressed, subtle signs of the enormity of the decision weighed on jurors. They revisited timelines, forensic reports, and expert analyses, debating the significance of each piece of evidence. Psychological testimony was carefully scrutinized, with jurors assessing whether Gacy's compulsive behaviors and personality traits reduced moral or legal responsibility. The process demanded intense focus, deliberative reasoning, and the ability to navigate complex ethical questions while remaining grounded in the legal framework. Inside the courtroom, Wayne Gacy remained outwardly composed, though the intensity of the trial had clearly affected him. Subtle signs of tension, clenched hands, fleeting expressions of frustration, betrayed his awareness of the impending judgment. The contrast between his public persona, carefully maintained for years, and the unfolding consequences of his crimes underscored the chilling duality that had defined his life. Observers noted that the trial itself had effectively dismantled the facade, leaving only the stark reality of his actions and their devastating impact on the community. Ultimately, the deliberation phase of the trial represented a convergence of law, psychology, and morality. Jurors were forced to interpret a life defined by extreme contrasts, to weigh evidence against mitigating factors, and to determine accountability for calculated, sustained acts of violence. The eventual verdict would not only decide Gacy's fate, but also mark a defining moment in the public understanding of serial predation, forensic investigation, and the complexities of human behavior under extreme circumstances. Chapter 12: Sentencing and the Question of Justice. The moment of judgment had arrived in the Wayne Gacy trial, a phase that would determine not only his fate, but also provide a societal reckoning with the depths of his crimes. After weeks of meticulous deliberation, Jurors returned to the courtroom, their expressions reflecting the weight of the extraordinary responsibility they had carried. The evidence presented, overwhelming in its clarity and detail, left little room for doubt regarding Gacy's culpability, yet the moral and psychological complexities of the case rendered the sentencing phase uniquely profound. The court reconvened, and the atmosphere was tense. Victims' families filled the gallery, their faces marked by grief, exhaustion, and the anticipation of closure. Members of the public, journalists, and legal observers also occupied seats, reflecting a collective societal engagement with the trial. The proceedings that followed were not merely a procedural conclusion but a formal acknowledgement of the atrocities committed and a societal affirmation of justice. During the sentencing phase, the prosecution presented a comprehensive account of the impact of Gacy's crimes, emphasizing the scale, premeditation, and sustained nature of his predation. Each victim was represented, their lives recounted through the evidence of disappearance, abuse, and death. Expert witnesses revisited forensic findings, detailing the systematic concealment, methods of restraint, and the calculated orchestration of murders. This presentation reinforced the argument that Gacy's actions were deliberate and fully cognizant, demanding the severest legal consequences. The defense, while limited in its ability to counter the clear evidence of guilt, continued to emphasize mitigating factors rooted in psychological analysis. Experts discussed Gacy's antisocial personality disorder, compulsive behaviors, and the formative traumas that had shaped his life. They argued that while these factors did not absolve him of responsibility, they provided context for his actions and merited consideration in determining sentencing. This dual approach underscored the tension between legal accountability and recognition of psychological complexity in cases involving extreme criminal behavior. The jury, instructed to deliberate on the appropriate sentence, faced the challenge of integrating legal standards, moral judgment, and the societal demand for justice. The severity of Gacy's crimes, multiple premeditated murders, sexual assault, and concealment of bodies, made the decision stark. Experts emphasized that sentencing in cases of serial predation needed to reflect not only punishment but also societal protection, deterrence, and acknowledgement of the profound harm inflicted upon victims and communities. In addition to the legal arguments, the emotional dimension of the proceedings played a significant role. Families of the victims had delivered statements reflecting grief, loss, and trauma, conveying the human cost of Gacy's actions. These personal narratives transformed abstract evidence into lived reality, reminding jurors and observers that each life represented a story, a future, and a family forever altered by his predation. The courtroom became a space where legal, moral, and emotional truths converged, demanding careful reflection and deliberate judgment. Media coverage of the sentencing phase captured public attention, reflecting the intense fascination with both the criminal case and the societal implications of the verdict. Reports emphasized Gacy's duality. The outwardly normal, socially integrated community member contrasted with the hidden, methodical serial killer. The nickname Killer Clown persisted in headlines, symbolizing the shocking discrepancy between perception and reality. Public engagement underscored the broader cultural impact of the trial, sparking conversations about criminal psychology, the justice system, and community vigilance. Legal scholars and psychologists analyzed the implications of the sentencing, emphasizing its importance in establishing precedent for future cases involving organized, high-functioning serial offenders. The meticulous presentation of evidence, combined with careful consideration of psychological testimony, highlighted the intersection of law, forensic science, and behavioral analysis. The trial reinforced the necessity of integrating investigative precision with expert interpretation, particularly in cases involving offenders who operate undetected through deception, charm, and calculated strategy. Gacy himself remained largely composed throughout the proceedings, though subtle signs of tension were observed. Occasional facial expressions, shifts in posture, and interactions with his legal team suggested awareness of the gravity of the moment and the culmination of years of criminal exposure. His dual existence, publicly charming, privately murderous, had been fully revealed, and the courtroom proceedings underscored the collapse of the carefully maintained facade. Observers noted that the trial had effectively stripped away any semblance of normalcy, leaving the stark reality of his actions and their consequences fully exposed. As the jury deliberated on the appropriate sentence, the complexity of the decision was evident. They had to consider multiple murders, the deliberate and systematic nature of the crimes, the psychological factors presented by the defense, and the broader implications for justice and societal protection. Each element required careful weighting, ensuring that the outcome would reflect both the severity of the offenses and the legal principles governing accountability. The deliberation process emphasized the gravity of responsibility placed upon jurors in cases of extreme criminality. By the end of this phase, it was clear that sentencing in the Gacy trial was more than a procedural formality. It represented a societal reckoning with the consequences of predation, deception, and concealed violence. The courtroom had become a stage for confronting human capacity for evil, the fragility of trust, and the mechanisms of justice in addressing acts of extreme criminality. The outcome would not only determine Gacy's fate, but also serve as a defining moment in public understanding of serial murder, forensic investigation, and the interplay between psychology, morality, and law. The jury's return to deliberate Gacy's sentence was an extraordinary moment, not only for those present in the courtroom but for the nation watching closely. The cumulative weight of evidence and testimony presented over the preceding months left the jurors with a harrowing responsibility to determine a sentence that reflected both the magnitude of Gacy's crimes and the societal need for justice. The courtroom, charged with tension, became a silent theater of anticipation as all present understood that this decision was the culmination of a complex and unprecedented trial. The prosecution's closing arguments for sentencing emphasized the calculated and organized nature of Gacy's killings. They meticulously recounted the sequence of disappearances, the means by which victims were restrained, and the manner in which bodies were concealed. Each forensic detail, from the intricate layout of Gacy's crawl space to the careful layering of soil over remains, painted a portrait of deliberate and methodical criminality. The prosecution underscored that these were not impulsive acts. They were premeditated, repetitive, and executed with conscious intent. The clarity of these arguments left a profound impression, reinforcing the notion that justice demanded the severest legal consequences. The defense, constrained by the overwhelming evidence of guilt, sought to ensure that the jury considered the psychological dimensions of Gacy's behavior. Experts revisited traits associated with antisocial personality disorder, compulsive behavior, and psychopathy, highlighting the interplay of these factors with formative trauma and social isolation. They argued that while these traits did not absolve Gacy of responsibility, they warranted consideration as mitigating factors. The defense's goal was not to excuse his actions but to ensure that sentencing accounted for the complexities of human psychology and the potential influence of internal compulsions on decision-making. Jurors faced the formidable challenge of integrating these competing perspectives. On one side was the irrefutable pattern of predation, manipulation, and concealment. On the other was a nuanced portrayal of Gacy's mental health history and psychological drives. They were instructed to weigh the evidence carefully, considering both legal standards and the broader implications of sentencing. The responsibility was immense, requiring the jury to navigate the intersection of morality, law, and psychology with precision and deliberation. The emotional impact of the trial was ever-present. Families of victims had recounted the devastating consequences of Gacy's actions, conveying grief, loss, and trauma that resonated deeply. These personal narratives transformed abstract evidence into tangible human suffering, reminding jurors that their decision would have profound moral implications. Each statement, tearful testimony, and recollection of a lost life underscored the human cost of the crimes and the need for a response that reflected both justice and accountability. Media coverage during this phase intensified public engagement. The killer clown image remained a focal point, symbolizing the jarring duality of Gacy's existence. Reports highlighted both the procedural aspects of the sentencing phase and the broader societal implications, reflecting an intense fascination with criminal psychology, forensic methodology, and the mechanisms by which an individual could evade detection for years. Public discourse centered not only on punishment but also on questions of how society identifies, understands, and responds to organized predatory behavior. Legal scholars emphasized that the Gacy trial was setting a precedent for handling cases involving highly organized, socially integrated serial offenders. The combination of detailed forensic evidence, psychological testimony, and methodical presentation of witness accounts provided a framework for future prosecutions. Experts highlighted how Gacy's case demonstrated the importance of recognizing behavioral patterns, integrating expert psychological analysis, and ensuring meticulous evidence handling. It was a testament to the evolution of the criminal justice system in addressing complex cases of extreme predation. As the jury concluded its deliberations, the courtroom atmosphere was tense, laden with anticipation. Gacy's composure remained, but subtle indicators, brief expressions, changes in posture, suggested awareness of the gravity of the moment. The duality that had defined his life, the socially acceptable, community-oriented contractor versus the methodical serial killer, had been fully exposed. The trial had stripped away any public facade, leaving only the stark reality of his crimes and the profound consequences of his predatory actions. The eventual verdict would reflect not only legal judgment but also societal values, the balance between justice, accountability, and the acknowledgement of human suffering. The deliberation process highlighted the extraordinary weight placed upon jurors, who had to interpret evidence, assess psychological testimony, and determine an appropriate sentence within the framework of the law. Every decision was informed by the understanding that Gacy's crimes had shattered lives, communities, and public trust, demanding a response proportionate to the magnitude of his offenses. In the end, the sentencing phase of the Gacy trial represented a convergence of justice, morality, and societal reckoning. It was a moment where law, forensic science, and psychology intersected, demanding careful consideration, intellectual rigor, and ethical reflection. The jury's decision would not merely determine the fate of John Wayne Gacy, but would also resonate as a defining moment in public consciousness, shaping the understanding of serial predation, forensic investigation, and the interplay of mental health and criminal accountability. The courtroom had borne witness to an extraordinary case, leaving a lasting imprint on both legal precedent and societal awareness of the darkest dimensions of human behavior. Chapter 13: Life on Death Row. Gacy behind bars. Following the sentencing, John Wayne Gacy was transferred to death row, a world markedly different from the suburban life he had once led. For the first time in years, the man who had maintained a dual existence, respected contractor by day, predator by night, found himself fully stripped of autonomy, confined within the stark confines of a correctional facility designed to house society's most dangerous individuals. Life on death row was rigid, regimented, and psychologically isolating, an environment that exposed him to both the monotony and the relentless weight of accountability. The routines of death row were strict. Each day followed a predetermined schedule of movement, meals, limited recreation, and enforced solitude. For Gacy, whose previous existence had been defined by the freedom to manipulate, charm, and navigate social networks, this sudden restriction was profound. Guards monitored every movement, visits were limited, and privacy was virtually non-existent. The claustrophobic nature of death row forced introspection, but it also magnified the isolation inherent in his circumstances, cutting him off from the world he had once dominated through fear and deception. Gacy's interactions with other inmates were constrained, governed by institutional rules that limited physical contact and communication. Despite his history of social manipulation, he now found himself navigating a hierarchy of control in which his previous skills held little currency. Relationships on death row were transactional, cautious, and largely devoid of genuine trust, reflecting a microcosm of power dynamics where survival required compliance, awareness, and vigilance. This environment challenged his ability to exert influence, highlighting the stark contrast between his former life of outward respectability and private domination. Psychologists and criminologists later studied Gacy's behavior on death row, noting patterns that mirrored aspects of his earlier psychological profile. Reports suggested that he attempted to manipulate interactions with staff and other inmates, leveraging charm or presenting himself as cooperative in order to gain small advantages. However, the controlled environment significantly limited his capacity for coercion or deceit. For the first time, his actions were fully observable, unshielded by the facades he had maintained in civilian life, allowing experts to evaluate behavioral tendencies in a controlled, high-security setting. Isolation and routine had a profound effect on Gacy's mental state. Confronted with the full magnitude of his crimes, the environment of death row removed many of the distractions and reinforcements that had previously supported his dual life. The monotony and seclusion created conditions for reflection, or at least self-awareness, though it is debated how genuine or consistent his introspection was. Some accounts indicated periods of remorse or contemplation, while others suggested continued narcissism, manipulation, and rationalization of his actions. This ambiguity highlighted the ongoing complexity of his psychological profile. Communication with the outside world was severely limited. Visits from family, lawyers, and occasional media representatives were strictly regulated. Gacy's attempts to maintain a sense of normalcy were challenged by the ever-present structure of the correctional system. Correspondence was monitored, and privileges were contingent upon behavior, creating a framework in which every action was subject to observation and accountability. For a man accustomed to controlling his environment, this loss of autonomy was profound, emphasizing the consequences of his crimes. Psychological experts noted that death row environments can have varying effects on inmates, particularly those with histories of manipulation, antisocial tendencies, and compulsive behaviors. For Gacy, the transition was both punitive and revealing. Researchers highlighted that highly organized offenders, when stripped of social and environmental leverage, often exhibit increased rigidity, attempts at influence within limited parameters, or heightened self-focus. In Gacy's case, both compliance and continued attempts at subtle manipulation were observed, reflecting a blend of adaptation to institutional life and persistent underlying personality traits. The daily life of Gacy on death row also included structured activities such as reading, exercise, and limited work assignments. While monotonous, these routines provided a framework that allowed both guards and psychologists to monitor behavior consistently. Observations revealed a man still capable of charm and superficial engagement, yet one whose freedom was drastically curtailed. The controlled environment exposed the boundaries of his psychological tendencies, illustrating how extreme restriction could mitigate predatory behavior but not necessarily alter fundamental personality characteristics. Media attention to Gacy's death row life was limited compared to the intensity of the trial, yet the public remained fascinated by updates. Stories highlighted his attempts to maintain personal routines, his correspondence with legal teams, and occasional interviews that provided insight into his mindset. These accounts offered a rare glimpse into the life of a convicted serial killer after the full consequences of their actions had been legally enforced, emphasizing the contrast between the man's prior social manipulation and his constrained reality behind bars. Observers also noted that Gacy's time on death row was marked by both adaptation and tension. While he conformed to institutional rules, his psychological need for control and recognition persisted. Analysts suggested that this combination of compliance and underlying personality traits illustrated the persistent duality in his character. A controlled outward conformity masking the same psychological complexities that had facilitated his crimes. Life on death row, therefore, provided both a practical punishment and a lens through which to understand the enduring aspects of his personality. In this isolated environment, Gacy confronted the reality of his actions in a direct, unmediated way. Stripped of community, influence, and the capacity for manipulation, he existed in a setting designed to expose both accountability and psychological resilience. Death row became not only a mechanism for justice but also a setting for ongoing observation, research, and reflection on the nature of extreme criminal behavior. The starkness of confinement, the rigidity of routine, and the psychological pressure of permanent accountability define this phase of Gacy's life, offering insight into the aftermath of one of America's most infamous criminal cases. The passage of time on death row was both monotonous and psychologically revealing for John Wayne Gacy. Confined within the stark walls of the facility, he faced a life stripped of the social maneuvering and manipulative charm that had defined his previous existence. The rigid structure of prison life eliminated the environment that had previously allowed him to exploit trust and exert influence over others, forcing him into a world of constant observation, controlled routines, and enforced isolation. For a man who had once mastered the art of duality, this abrupt change was both a punishment and a profound test of psychological endurance. Each day followed a strict regimen. Inmates were confined to cells for the majority of the day, permitted limited movement during recreation periods, and subjected to thorough supervision. Meals, hygiene, and any activity outside the cell were monitored, leaving little room for spontaneity or manipulation. Gacy's previous strategies of charm and coercion had little applicability in this environment, as authority and strict regulation defined every interaction. This complete lack of autonomy highlighted the severity of the consequences of his crimes and underscored the reality of life as a convicted serial killer. Despite these constraints, Gacy's behavioral patterns revealed that certain aspects of his personality persisted. Correctional officers reported his efforts to adapt within institutional boundaries, including compliance with rules, participation in permitted activities, and strategic interactions with staff. Simultaneously, he displayed subtle attempts to gain psychological advantage, leveraging superficial charm or presenting himself as cooperative in order to secure minor privileges. These behaviors reflected the enduring elements of his manipulative personality. Though constrained by an environment designed to prevent exploitation, interactions with other inmates were heavily regulated. Death row culture demanded caution, with social dynamics governed by unspoken hierarchies, potential threats, and institutional rules. While Gacy had previously exercised social dominance through deception and coercion, he now had to navigate a confined social environment where trust was limited and manipulation carried significant risks. Reports indicated that he was largely solitary, maintaining minimal interaction while cautiously monitoring his surroundings. This isolation further accentuated the contrast between his life before incarceration and the regimented reality of death row. Psychologists observed that confinement often magnifies aspects of personality, revealing tendencies that may be obscured in the outside world. For Gacy, isolation and monotony exposed both rigidity and the persistent need for control. Analysts noted that while he adapted to institutional life outwardly, underlying traits, narcissism, compulsive behavior, and calculated self-presentation, remained. Death row became a natural laboratory for understanding the persistence of personality characteristics in the absence of environmental reinforcement and the capacity for predation. Gacy's correspondence and interactions with the outside world were similarly limited. Legal visits, monitored letters, and occasional interviews provided rare opportunities for communication, but each interaction was subject to scrutiny. Reports suggest that he attempted to use these opportunities strategically, whether to maintain a narrative, influence public perception, or secure legal advantage. Even in constrained circumstances, the duality that had characterized his life, public compliance versus private psychological persistence, was evident. The mental strain of death row cannot be overstated. Gacy had been stripped of freedom, confronted with the magnitude of his crimes, and placed in a highly controlled, isolated environment. The psychological pressure of constant accountability, limited autonomy, and awareness of impending execution created a unique context for reflection, self-perception, and behavioral adaptation. Observers noted that these conditions can either lead to genuine introspection or reinforce defensive and narcissistic tendencies, depending on the individual's psychological structure. In Gacy's case, evidence suggests a combination of both: moments of reflection interspersed with rationalization and attempts to manage perception. Media coverage of Gacy's life behind bars offered the public a rare glimpse into the post-conviction reality of a serial killer. Stories focused on his adaptation to prison routines, interactions with staff, and ongoing legal efforts. While public fascination persisted, these narratives also served an educational function, illustrating the psychological and behavioral consequences of incarceration, the nature of death row confinement, and the challenges of managing high-risk offenders. The media spotlight maintained a connection between the crimes and their societal repercussions, ensuring that the lessons of the Gacy case remained salient. Gacy's existence on death row was a study in contrasts. Outwardly, he conformed to rules and participated in structured activities. Inwardly, psychological patterns of manipulation, control, and self-focus persisted. This juxtaposition highlighted the enduring nature of personality traits, even when stripped of opportunity and freedom. Analysts concluded that while death row effectively constrained predatory behavior, it did not erase the underlying traits that had facilitated his crimes, providing a stark demonstration of the complexity of criminal psychology. Finally, life on death row emphasized the broader societal implications of Gacy's case. Beyond punishment, it illustrated the importance of secure, controlled environments for managing individuals capable of extreme violence. It reinforced the value of forensic, psychological, and legal mechanisms in apprehending, convicting, and containing such offenders. For John Wayne Gacy, death row represented the inescapable consequences of his actions, a world defined by structure, observation, and the loss of the freedom and influence that had enabled his years of criminal activity. The starkness of confinement, the psychological pressures, and the impossibility of escape created a reality in which the duality of his former life was fully exposed, ultimately underscoring the finality of justice. Chapter 14: Appeals, Legal Battles, and the Road to Execution Following his sentencing and transfer to death row, John Wayne Gacy entered a prolonged and complex phase of legal maneuvering. Death row did not mark the end of his story in the courtroom. Instead, it opened a new chapter defined by appeals, procedural challenges, and continued scrutiny of both his guilt and the constitutionality of his sentence. These legal battles would last decades, offering insight into the American justice system, the intricacies of capital punishment, and the interplay between legal procedure and the psychological profile of convicted serial offenders. Gacy's legal team immediately sought avenues to challenge the verdict and sentence. Their strategies encompass claims of procedural error, ineffective assistance of counsel, and questions regarding the application of the death penalty in his specific case. Each motion, writ, or appeal required meticulous preparation, referencing the vast volume of evidence, courtroom transcripts, and legal precedents. The defense aimed to identify any procedural misstep that could warrant a retrial, reduced sentence, or other legal remedy, highlighting the multifaceted nature of post-conviction legal work in high-profile cases. Among the arguments presented were claims related to the presentation of psychiatric evidence. The defense contended that aspects of Gacy's mental health had been inadequately considered or fully integrated into the sentencing process. Psychiatric evaluations, evidence of personality disorders, and testimony regarding compulsion and psychological development were cited as factors that should have influenced both verdict and sentence. While the courts consistently acknowledged these arguments, they repeatedly determined that the premeditated and systematic nature of Gacy's crimes outweighed mitigating psychological considerations. The appeals process itself was lengthy and intricate. Federal and state courts were both involved, each evaluating the sufficiency of trial procedures, potential violations of rights, and the appropriateness of capital punishment in this context. Lawyers navigated an evolving legal landscape in which precedents regarding the death penalty, procedural fairness, and the handling of psychological evidence were continually refined. These appeals became a prolonged dialogue between defense advocates, prosecutors, and the judiciary, demonstrating the complexity and duration of the legal system when addressing capital cases. Gacy's own engagement with the legal process was notable. Despite the overwhelming evidence and public awareness of his crimes, he actively participated in his defense, offering strategic input and reviewing filings. While some viewed this involvement as an extension of his manipulative tendencies, others interpreted it as a demonstration of intelligence and adaptability under extreme circumstances. His engagement illustrated a continued desire to influence outcomes within the confines of legal boundaries, a reflection of the duality that had defined his life both before and after incarceration. Throughout this period, media coverage remained intense. Reports highlighted procedural developments, outcomes of appeals, and expert analysis of the legal strategies employed. The public's fascination persisted, fueled by both the grotesque nature of his crimes and the enduring nickname Killer Clown, which continued to dominate headlines. Commentary often focused on the tension between legal formalities and moral outrage, the balance between due process and the desire for finality, and the societal implications of prolonged death row litigation. Legal scholars and criminologists observed that the Gacy appeals process offered valuable lessons about capital punishment. The careful examination of procedural fairness, psychological evidence, and the evolving interpretation of law in cases of extreme criminality highlighted the critical role of appellate courts in safeguarding constitutional rights. At the same time, the process illustrated the challenges inherent in balancing justice for victims with legal safeguards for defendants, particularly in cases that evoke intense public emotion and scrutiny. A notable element of Gacy's post-conviction life was the repeated review of his death sentence. Courts examined whether procedural irregularities, jury instructions, and the consideration of mitigating evidence met constitutional standards. Each appeal required detailed analysis of the original trial record, forensic evidence, and the interpretation of psychiatric testimony. The legal process emphasized the necessity of meticulous documentation, careful evaluation of expert opinions, and the consistency of judicial application in high-profile and emotionally charged cases. During this period, Gacy's psychological state was influenced by both confinement and the ongoing legal proceedings. The uncertainty of prolonged appeals introduced a unique form of psychological pressure, distinct from the isolation of death row. While some inmates exhibit despair, resignation, or emotional withdrawal under such circumstances, others, as in Gacy's case, engage strategically, applying their cognitive skills and manipulative tendencies to navigate procedural complexities. This ongoing engagement reinforced aspects of his personality while demonstrating adaptability under pressure. Media and public attention also focused on the ethical and societal dimensions of his prolonged appeals. Debates emerged over the length of time between sentencing and execution, the psychological toll on inmates, and the impact on victims' families awaiting final closure. Gacy's appeals became a focal point for broader discussions about the death penalty, the efficiency and fairness of the legal system, and the responsibilities of society in administering justice for extreme criminal acts. The long trajectory of Gacy's appeals highlighted a fundamental tension in the American justice system: the need to uphold legal standards and procedural fairness versus the societal and moral demand for finality. Each stage of litigation, whether a motion for a new trial, a habeas corpus petition, or a review of sentencing procedures, served as both a legal safeguard and a reminder of the complexity of administering justice in cases of extreme violence. In this context, Gacy's journey through the appellate system was emblematic of the broader challenges faced by courts in balancing law, morality, and public interest. As John Wayne Gacy's appeals progressed, the extended legal battle became a defining feature of his life on death row. Each motion, writ, and hearing served not only as an attempt to challenge the verdict or sentence, but also as a mechanism for delaying the finality of execution. The process demanded constant engagement from his legal team, who meticulously reviewed trial transcripts, examined forensic evidence, and scrutinized the application of legal procedures. For Gacy, this prolonged legal journey offered an avenue to exercise strategic influence and maintain a semblance of control within an otherwise rigidly constrained environment. One of the central arguments in Gacy's appeals involved the adequacy of legal counsel during the original trial. The defense argued that certain tactical decisions, presentation of evidence, or handling of witness testimony may have fallen short of constitutional standards. These claims necessitated in-depth review by appellate courts, requiring judges to evaluate the actions of trial attorneys within the context of prevailing legal norms and standards. While these arguments were consistently examined, courts ultimately determined that the trial had adhered to legal procedures and that any minor deficiencies did not invalidate the overwhelming evidence of Gacy's guilt. Another significant aspect of the appeals focused on the integration of psychological evidence into sentencing decisions. The defense maintained that Gacy's mental health history, including traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder and compulsive behavior, should have had a greater influence on the jury's determination of his sentence. Experts testified regarding the impact of formative trauma, social isolation, and psychological disorders, highlighting the complexity of assessing moral and legal responsibility. The courts, however, consistently concluded that the systematic and deliberate nature of his crimes outweighed mitigating factors, reinforcing the appropriateness of the death penalty in his case. Throughout these proceedings, the public remained intensely engaged. Media outlets reported every development in the appeals process, highlighting the tension between legal rigor and public desire for resolution. The nickname Killer Clown continued to dominate headlines, symbolizing the enduring fascination with Gacy's dual life and the grotesque contrast between his outward persona and hidden criminality. Public discourse frequently explored ethical questions surrounding the death penalty, the psychological evaluation of offenders, and the societal implications of prolonged litigation in cases of extreme violence. Gacy's own behavior during the appeals process reflected his persistent need for involvement and control. He reviewed legal filings, provided strategic input to attorneys, and occasionally engaged with the media, reinforcing aspects of his manipulative tendencies. This engagement highlighted the adaptability of his personality under pressure. Despite confinement and public exposure, he continued to navigate complex systems in a manner that maintained personal influence, albeit within the constraints of the law. Psychologists noted that such behavior exemplified the resilience and calculated nature often observed in organized offenders. The prolonged appeals also took a psychological toll on victims' families. While the initial verdict had provided legal affirmation of guilt, the extended timeline of litigation prolonged uncertainty, delaying the sense of closure that accompanies finality in capital cases. Families were forced to revisit painful memories, relive testimony, and confront media coverage repeatedly, creating an ongoing emotional burden. These dynamics underscored the broader societal costs of prolonged death row litigation, highlighting the intersection of law, justice, and the lived experience of those affected by violent crime in addition to procedural and psychological arguments. Gacy's appeals occasionally examined broader legal questions surrounding capital punishment. Issues of constitutionality, fairness, and ethical application of the death penalty were discussed at both state and federal levels. Scholars and legal analysts used the case to explore the mechanisms of appellate review, the protection of defendants' rights, and the societal role of prolonged legal processes in ensuring justice. Gacy's case became a focal point for these debates, illustrating how extreme criminal cases test the boundaries of law, ethics, and public expectation. During this period, Gacy's life on death row remained largely regimented, with his daily existence dominated by confinement, routine, and observation. Despite this, the ongoing legal proceedings provided a form of engagement, a continuation of the strategic thinking that had characterized much of his life. This dynamic reinforced the persistence of his cognitive and manipulative abilities even in extreme restriction, offering researchers and observers a unique perspective on the psychological resilience of organized offenders under conditions of severe limitation. Ultimately, Gacy's decades-long navigation of appeals highlighted the intricate interplay between justice, legal procedure, and psychological understanding. The appellate system functioned as a safeguard against procedural error, ensuring that even in cases of overwhelming evidence and public outrage, legal rights were respected. At the same time, the process demonstrated the challenges inherent in administering capital punishment fairly, balancing public interest with procedural rigor and ethical oversight. By the time the appeals process neared its conclusion, it was evident that Gacy's legal journey was not merely a delay in execution, but a reflection of the broader complexities of the American justice system. His case illustrated how meticulously organized offenders could engage with legal systems, leverage procedural safeguards, and navigate prolonged litigation, all while confined to the stark realities of death row. The road to execution was both a legal and psychological odyssey, demonstrating the persistence of human complexity, the endurance of personality traits under extreme conditions, and the societal imperative to ensure justice is carried out with care, rigor, and integrity. Chapter 15: Final Days and Execution. The end of the killer clown. As the years on death row stretched into decades, John Wayne Gacy's life moved inexorably toward its final chapter. The prolonged appeals, legal challenges, and procedural reviews had delayed the ultimate resolution, yet the inevitability of execution remained a constant presence. For Gacy, a man who had long exerted control over his environment, manipulated perception, and maintained a dual existence, the approach of finality marked a profound confrontation with mortality, accountability, and the consequences of his crimes. The final days leading up to execution were characterized by strict routine, heightened security, and intense observation. Gacy's environment remained regimented, with every movement monitored by correctional staff. The stark confinement of death row, coupled with the psychological weight of impending execution, created conditions that tested both resilience and composure. Observers, psychologists, and legal professionals were attentive to his behavior, noting the interplay between control, anxiety, and introspection as he faced the ultimate consequence of his actions. Interactions with prison staff in these final days were carefully managed. While Gacy had previously attempted to influence, charm, or manipulate personnel, the rigid protocols of the correctional system left little room for such strategies. Visits were limited, correspondence monitored, and movements strictly regulated, leaving him to confront both the solitude of death row and the permanence of his sentence. Reports suggested that while outwardly composed, there were subtle signs of tension, reflection, and heightened awareness of mortality, underscoring the human dimension of his final days. Throughout this period, media and public interest remained intense. The story of Gacy's crimes, trial, and ultimate sentence continued to capture national attention, reflecting enduring fascination with both the grotesque and the psychological dimensions of his life. Journalists and commentators explored not only the procedural aspects of his execution but also the broader cultural and ethical questions it raised. The narrative of the killer clown had become firmly embedded in public consciousness, symbolizing the terrifying dichotomy between social normalcy and hidden predation. Legal and ethical considerations were rigorously observed in preparation for execution. The state ensured compliance with procedural standards, oversight mechanisms, and protocols governing capital punishment. Execution teams coordinated meticulously, while attorneys monitored for any last-minute legal interventions. The process emphasized both precision and transparency, reflecting societal imperatives to carry out justice in a manner that is lawful, ethical, and accountable. Every aspect was designed to ensure that the culmination of decades-long litigation and incarceration adhered to the rule of law. Psychological analysis during Gacy's final days offered insight into the mindset of an individual confronting imminent mortality after a lifetime of manipulation, control, and deception. Experts noted the complex interplay between resignation, strategic self-presentation, and residual attempts to influence perception. Even in the face of absolute constraint, elements of his characteristic duality persisted. Outward compliance paired with inner reflection, moments of seeming vulnerability tempered by enduring narcissism, and the final recognition of accountability juxtaposed with attempts at self-preservation. Family and victims' representatives were also a focus of these final days. The execution represented not only a legal and procedural event but also a form of closure for those affected by Gacy's crimes. Families prepared to witness, or at least acknowledge, the final outcome of a process that had spanned decades. Their experiences reflected the broader societal dimension of capital punishment, the intersection of legal resolution, moral judgment, and emotional reckoning for those whose lives had been irrevocably altered by violence. As the date of execution approached, security measures intensified. The facility coordinated transportation, staffing, and logistical arrangements to ensure the process adhered to both legal and ethical standards. Witnesses, including members of law enforcement, legal representatives, and select observers were prepared for a meticulously controlled procedure. Every detail, from timing to verification of identity and compliance with protocols, underscored the gravity of the event and the societal responsibility to administer justice responsibly. The psychological environment surrounding Gacy's final days also highlighted the interplay of anticipation, inevitability, and human reflection. For a man who had spent years evading detection, controlling narrative, and maintaining dual personas, the transition to absolute constraint and impending mortality marked a unique psychological juncture. Observers noted periods of introspection, moments of tension, and the persistence of personality traits that had defined his interactions throughout life and incarceration. This period offered an unparalleled window into the resilience, adaptability, and limitations of personality under extreme circumstances. Media coverage in this period focused not only on procedural aspects but also on broader societal and ethical implications. Analysts discussed the nature of capital punishment, the efficacy of prolonged appeals, and the moral questions surrounding the administration of ultimate justice. The story of John Wayne Gacy, from his outwardly normal suburban life to his horrific crimes and ultimate accountability, served as a lens through which society examined both the darkest aspects of human behavior and the mechanisms of the justice system designed to respond to it. In these final days, the stark contrast between Gacy's public persona and his hidden atrocities remained ever present. The nickname Killer Clown continued to resonate, symbolizing the terrifying duality of a man who had managed to evade suspicion for years while committing unspeakable acts. Confronted with the reality of execution, Gacy's life on death row, and the decades of legal, psychological, and societal examination that preceded it, culminated in a final confrontation with the consequences of his actions, the legal system, and the moral imperatives that had defined his journey from suburban contractor to convicted serial killer. The day of John Wayne Gacy's execution was approached with meticulous precision, both procedurally and psychologically. Death row officials coordinated every element to ensure compliance with legal and ethical standards, emphasizing the gravity of ending a life sanctioned by the state. Witnesses, including law enforcement personnel, members of the media, legal representatives, and select family members of victims, were present to observe the final chapter of a decades-long saga that had captivated and horrified the nation. The culmination of Gacy's life was not simply a procedural event but a societal reckoning with one of the darkest examples of hidden human depravity. Gacy, fully aware of the impending outcome, faced the event with outward composure, though subtle signs of tension and anticipation betrayed the psychological weight of the moment. Decades of control, manipulation, and social adaptation could not shield him from the inescapable reality of mortality. In these final moments, the carefully maintained facade of normalcy and charm that had characterized so much of his life dissolved entirely, leaving only the stark truth of his crimes and their consequences. Correctional staff observed closely, ensuring both safety and adherence to established protocols, while Gacy's own psychological state became a final study in human behavior under extreme pressure. As he was prepared for execution, officials conducted multiple verification procedures. Identity, legal status, and procedural compliance were confirmed in a series of checks designed to leave no room for error. This meticulous process underscored the seriousness with which the justice system approached the administration of capital punishment, particularly in a case as historically and culturally significant as Gacy's. Every step, from escort to the execution chamber to final verification, was a convergence of legal responsibility, ethical oversight, and societal expectation. Inside the execution chamber, Gacy was positioned according to established protocol. The procedure, carried out with precision, reflected both the culmination of legal processes and the broader societal imperative to administer justice for the victims of his crimes. Witnesses noted the tension, the silence, and the weight of historical significance as the final phase of the killer clown's life unfolded. The ritualized nature of the execution highlighted the stark intersection of law, morality, and human consequence, providing a controlled environment in which ultimate justice was to be enacted. Throughout this process, the psychological complexity of Gacy's life was on full display. Decades of manipulation, duality, and concealed predation culminated in a scenario where all external influence was stripped away, leaving only the internal confrontation with mortality and accountability. Analysts noted that even in these extreme conditions, elements of his personality, strategic thinking, composure, and self-awareness remained evident, though constrained by circumstance. The execution offered an unfiltered lens through which to examine the final interplay of criminal psychology, human behavior, and the consequences of sustained predation. The execution of John Wayne Gacy also represented a moment of closure for society and for the families of his victims. While no legal or procedural act could fully restore lives lost or heal the wounds inflicted, the event marked the formal conclusion of the judicial process. For victims' families, it offered a form of resolution, a recognition of the enormity of their loss, and the societal affirmation of justice. This aspect of the execution highlighted the dual purpose of capital punishment, both punitive and symbolic, serving as an acknowledgement of irreparable harm while enforcing the consequences of extreme criminality. Media coverage of the execution was extensive but carefully regulated. The event was contextualized within both historical and societal frameworks, examining the trajectory from Gacy's outwardly normal life to his horrifying crimes and ultimate accountability. Analysts, psychologists, and legal experts provided commentary on the procedural precision, ethical considerations, and implications for future cases. Public fascination persisted, driven not merely by the sensationalism of the killer clown narrative but by deeper curiosity about the psychology of extreme offenders and the mechanisms by which society administers justice. Following the execution, reflections on Gacy's life and crimes continued to resonate. Legal scholars analyzed the extensive appellate process, the integration of psychological evidence, and the implications for the administration of capital punishment. Criminologists and psychologists studied his life on death row, the persistence of personality traits under extreme confinement, and the dynamics of remorse, adaptation, and reflection in his final days. Cultural commentators examined the societal impact of his crimes, the duality of public persona versus hidden violence, and the ways in which communities, law enforcement, and media narratives shape collective memory of extreme offenders. Ultimately, John Wayne Gacy's death marked the conclusion of a narrative defined by manipulation, violence, and duality. The killer clown persona, which had both fascinated and terrified the public, became an enduring symbol of hidden predation, the complexity of criminal psychology, and the societal need for vigilance. His execution closed the legal chapter but opened ongoing reflection on human behavior, forensic investigation, and the mechanisms by which justice confronts extreme criminality. The convergence of law, morality, psychology, and societal oversight in Gacy's final days offers a profound case study, revealing both the consequences of his actions and the broader implications for understanding human darkness and the aftermath. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy persists in multiple dimensions. As a cautionary tale of concealed evil, a benchmark for forensic and legal practice, and a lens for exploring the psychological architecture of organized offenders. His life and crimes continue to be examined in criminology, psychology, law, and cultural studies, serving as a stark reminder of the depths of human behavior, the importance of investigative vigilance, and the enduring societal quest for justice, closure and understanding.